Hello, dear friend, and welcome to this quiet corner of history. Tonight, we set aside the noise of the present and wander gently into the stories of the past. Whether you're curled up beneath the blankets, resting after a long day, or simply seeking calm company for your evening, I'm grateful you've chosen to be here. If you'd like, share in the comments where in the world you're listening from. I always love seeing how far this community stretches across time zones and continents. And if these soothing journeys through history bring you comfort, consider subscribing so we can meet again. For now, let's loosen the weight of the modern world and step softly into the echoes of yesterday. Tonight, we journey to a time when the world was young and filled with wonder, when every mountain peak held a god, every river sang with the voice of a nymph, and the very stars themselves told stories of heroes and heartbreak. We travel to ancient Greece, but not to the marble columns and philosophical academies you might imagine. Instead, we drift into the realm of myth, where the boundaries between earth and heaven were gossamer thin, where mortals walked alongside immortals, and where every natural phenomenon, thunder, sunrise, the changing seasons, held within it a sacred narrative that helped our ancestors make sense of this strange and beautiful existence. The myths of ancient Greece are not merely old stories. They are the dreams of an entire civilization, the poetry through which they understood love and loss, courage and hubris, fate and freedom. These tales have survived thousands of years not because they are relics to be preserved behind glass, but because they continue to speak to something eternal within us. In the quiet moments before sleep, when the boundary between waking and dreaming grows thin, these ancient voices seem to whisper across the centuries, reminding us that though empires rise and fall, though technologies transform our lives beyond recognition, the human heart remains remarkably unchanged. So settle in, let your breathing slow, and allow yourself to drift back to a time when the world was painted in the colors of imagination, when every shadow held mystery, and when the greatest truths about human nature were told not through treatises or textbooks, but through stories that have outlived the very civilization that birthed them. We begin, as all things began in the Greek imagination, with chaos. Not the disorder we might think of today, but rather a vast, yawning emptiness, a primordial void from which all existence would eventually emerge. Picture, if you can, an infinite darkness, neither cold nor warm, neither silent nor noisy, but simply present, pregnant with all the possibilities of creation. From this chaos came the first entities, beings so ancient and fundamental that they were more like forces than persons. Gaia, the earth herself, rose from the void. Not as a goddess in human form, but as the very ground of being, the foundation upon which all life would build its home. And from Gaia came Uranus, the sky, stretching endlessly above her, and together they began the great work of peopling the cosmos. Their children were the Titans, beings of immense power and strange beauty, each one embodying some essential aspect of the world. Oceanus was the great river that encircled the earth, his waters holding the boundaries of the known world. Hyperion was light itself, blazing with the fire that would one day become the sun. Mnemosyne was memory, that mysterious faculty by which the past lives on within us. And there was Kronos, called the Crooked One, youngest and most cunning of the Titans, who would play a role in the dramas to come that still makes us shudder with its primal power. But Uranus, proud and jealous, feared the strength of his children. He looked upon the Titans and saw in them the potential for his own overthrow, and so he thrust them back into Gaia's womb, refusing to let them walk freely upon the earth. Can you imagine the pain of this, a mother forced to harbor her fully grown children within her, unable to let them live their own lives? Gaia suffered under this cruelty, and in her suffering, she conceived a desperate plan. She fashioned from her own substance a great sickle of adamant, harder than any earthly metal, and she called out to her imprisoned children, asking which among them would dare to free his siblings and claim his rightful place in the cosmos. Only Kronos had the courage, or perhaps the ambition, to accept. And so it was that when Uranus next came to embrace Gaia, Kronos emerged from his hiding place and with one terrible stroke of the adamantine sickle, he severed his father from his power, casting the wounded sky far above the earth, forever separated from his beloved. From the blood that fell, the Furies were born, those ancient spirits of vengeance who punish those who betray family bonds. And from the foam where Uranus's divine essence fell into the sea, something miraculous happened, something we will return to soon, for from that foam would rise Aphrodite, goddess of love, born from violence yet embodying beauty, a paradox that the Greeks understood better than we sometimes do. With Uranus defeated, Kronos became lord of the cosmos, and the age of the Titans began. It was a strange time, neither wholly dark nor wholly light. Kronos took his sister Rhea as his wife, and together they ruled over a world that knew neither the chaos of the primordial void nor the ordered civilization that would come later. The Titans were like the forces of nature itself, powerful, indifferent, operating according to their own inscrutable logic. Prometheus, the Titan of forethought, could see into the future with clear eyes. His brother Epimetheus possessed afterthought, always understanding too late. Atlas stood at the western edge of the world, bearing upon his broad shoulders the weight of the sky. And Helios, the Titan of the sun, drove his golden chariot across the heavens each day, his passage marking the rhythm of mortal life. But Kronos had learned a terrible lesson from his father's fall, and that lesson poisoned him. He had heard a prophecy, for prophecy runs through these myths like a golden thread, speaking of destinies that cannot be escaped. That one of his own children would overthrow him, just as he had overthrown Uranus. And so Kronos, in his fear and his desire to cling to power, committed an act that echoes through mythology with its horror. Each time Rhea gave birth to a child, Kronos would take the infant and swallow it whole, imprisoning his own sons and daughters in the darkness of his belly. First went Hestia, gentle goddess of the hearth. Then Demeter, who would become the great nurturer of the earth. Next came Hera, regal and proud even as a baby. Then Hades, destined for the shadowy underworld, and Poseidon, who would one day rule the seas. Each child Rhea bore, Kronos consumed, and Rhea's heart broke a little more with each loss. But mothers, as anyone who has known a mother's love can tell you, are resourceful when it comes to protecting their young. When Rhea's sixth child was born, she could bear the loss no longer. She wrapped a stone in swaddling clothes and presented it to Kronos, who in his arrogance and haste swallowed it without examining it closely. The real infant, a baby boy squalling with the strength that would one day shake the heavens, Rhea spirited away to a cave on the island of Crete, far from Kronos's watchful eyes. This baby was Zeus, and his childhood on Crete was like something from a half-remembered dream. The nymphs cared for him, feeding him honey and the milk of the goat Amalthea. The Curetes, young warriors devoted to Rhea, would clash their spears against their shields whenever baby Zeus cried, drowning out the sound so that Kronos would not hear and discover the deception. Zeus grew strong on that hidden island, nurtured not by power but by love, by the fierce devotion of those who believed in a better future than the one Kronos offered. And when Zeus came of age, when he was ready to claim his destiny, he returned to confront his father. There are different versions of how this confrontation unfolded. Mythology is like that, existing in many forms simultaneously, each telling offering its own truth. In some versions, Zeus tricks Kronos into drinking a potion that makes him vomit up the children he had swallowed. In others, Zeus simply defeats him in combat and forces him to disgorge his siblings. But however it happened, the result was the same. From Kronos's belly came first the stone he had swallowed thinking it was Zeus, and then, one by one, the divine children he had imprisoned. They emerged fully grown, these gods and goddesses, and they were grateful to their youngest brother for their freedom. What followed was the Titanomachy, the great war between the Olympian gods and the Titans, a cosmic battle that shook the very foundations of the world. For 10 years the war raged, neither side able to gain the upper hand. The Olympians fought from their fortress on Mount Olympus, that towering peak where the snow never melts and the air is so pure it seems to shimmer with divine light. The Titans, meanwhile, commanded the heights of Mount Othrys, and between these two powers the earth itself became a battlefield. But Zeus, ever cunning, knew that they needed allies, and he remembered the forgotten ones, those whom Uranus and then Kronos had locked away in the deepest pits of the earth. He descended into Tartarus, that place of shadow and suffering far beneath even the underworld, and there he found the Cyclopes and the hundred-handed ones, beings so powerful and strange that even the Titans had feared them. Zeus freed them from their chains, and in gratitude, they pledged themselves to his cause. The Cyclopes, master craftsmen, forged weapons of divine power, for Zeus, the thunderbolt that would become his signature and his terror. For Poseidon, a trident that could shake the earth and command the seas. For Hades, a helmet of invisibility that would let him move unseen through the world. Armed with these weapons, with the loyalty of his siblings, and with the strength of those who had been oppressed, Zeus led the final charge against the Titans. The sky split with lightning. The earth quaked. The very fabric of reality seemed to tear under the strain of such immense powers clashing. And in the end, the Titans fell. Kronos himself was bound in chains and cast into Tartarus, along with those Titans who had fought against the new order. Atlas, who had led the Titan forces, received a special punishment. He was condemned to stand at the western edge of the world, holding up the sky for all eternity. His strength that had threatened Zeus now turned to Zeus's purpose. But not all the Titans were punished. Some, like Helios who continued to drive the sun across the sky, had remained neutral or had sided with Zeus. And others, like Prometheus, were too valuable to lose, for Prometheus possessed knowledge and skill that even Zeus recognized would be needed in the world to come. With the war won, the three brothers, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, cast lots to divide the cosmos among them. Zeus claimed the sky and the role of king of the gods, a position he had already earned through his leadership in the war. Poseidon received the seas, and he made his palace in the depths where the water is so dark and cold that sunlight never reaches, yet where his divine presence made a realm of strange beauty. And Hades drew the underworld, the realm of the dead, a kingdom he would rule not with cruelty but with stern justice, offering all souls their appointed place after the brief flicker of mortal life had ended. The earth itself they held in common, and it was on earth that the real drama of mythology would unfold, for the earth was where gods and mortals would meet, where the divine would touch the human, and where countless stories of love, betrayal, heroism, and tragedy would weave themselves into the fabric of Greek consciousness. Zeus established his throne on Mount Olympus, and around him gathered the Olympian gods, each with their own domain, their own personality, their own desires and flaws. These were not the distant, perfect deities of some religions. The Greek gods were intensely present, intensely alive, subject to jealousy and love, anger and compassion, wisdom and folly. They were, in many ways, humans writ large, immortal beings with human hearts, and that is perhaps why their stories continue to resonate, because in them we see ourselves, our own struggles and triumphs reflected in immortal form. Hera, Zeus's wife and queen of the gods, presided over marriage and family, though her own marriage was famously troubled by Zeus's countless infidelities. She was proud, regal, vengeful when wronged, yet also capable of deep loyalty and fierce protection of those she loved. Athena, born fully armed from Zeus's own head after he swallowed her mother Metis, embodied wisdom and strategic warfare, the kind of courage that comes from intellect rather than mere aggression. Apollo, god of light, music, prophecy, and healing, was the very image of classical beauty, his every action suffused with grace and purpose. His twin sister Artemis, goddess of the hunt and the moon, raced through the forests with her band of nymphs, independent and fierce, protecting the wild places and the wild creatures. Aphrodite, born from the sea foam, was love and beauty incarnate, her power so great that even the other gods were not immune to her influence. Ares, god of war, represented the brutal, chaotic aspect of conflict, not the strategic warfare of Athena, but the blood-soaked madness of battle. Hephaestus, the smith god, worked his forge beneath volcanoes, crafting wonders despite, or perhaps because of, his limp and his rejection by his mother Hera, who had cast him from Olympus for being less than perfect. Hermes, the trickster and messenger, flew on winged sandals between the divine and mortal realms, god of travelers, merchants, thieves, and all who crossed boundaries. Demeter, goddess of the harvest, made the earth fertile with her blessing, though her story would become one of the most poignant in all of mythology. And Hestia, eldest of the Olympians, chose a quiet role as goddess of the hearth, the gentle flame at the center of every home, rarely leaving Olympus but essential to the peace and warmth that makes a house a home. This, then, was the family of gods who would shape the world, and their first great act of creation was to make humanity itself. Though here again the stories vary, each offering its own insight. In one telling, Prometheus, that titan who had sided with Zeus, fashioned humans from clay, breathing into them the spark of life. In another, humans emerged from the earth itself, children of Gaia like all living things. But however we came to be, the early history of humanity in Greek mythology was tumultuous, for the gods were still learning how to relate to these strange mortal creatures who resembled them but died so quickly, burning bright and brief like candle flames in the eternal night. The first generations of humans lived in what poets called the Golden Age, a time when Kronos still ruled and the world was gentler than it would become. Humans lived like gods, without labor or suffering, the earth providing all they needed. They knew no illness, no old age that brought pain. When their time came, they simply fell asleep and did not wake, passing into the next world as peacefully as a child drifting off after a day of play. But this age could not last, for Zeus had overthrown Kronos, and with the new order came new realities. The Silver Age followed, and humans became more like we are now. Born helpless, requiring long years to reach maturity, subject to the pains and difficulties of life. They were less pious than their predecessors, forgetting to honor the gods, and for this Zeus swept them away. Then came the Bronze Age, when humans were hard and warlike, loving conflict, ultimately destroying each other through their own violence. Next was the Age of Heroes, a strange interlude when demigods walked the earth, children born of unions between immortals and mortals, beings of great power and tragic destiny. And finally came the Iron Age, the age in which the Greeks believed they themselves lived, an age of toil and struggle, where goodness was difficult and suffering common, yet also an age where virtue meant something precisely because it was hard-won. It was Prometheus who gave humanity its greatest gift, and for that gift he paid a terrible price. Prometheus loved humans, seeing in them a potential that even Zeus did not fully appreciate. He watched them shivering in the cold, living in caves, helpless before the beasts and the elements, and his heart went out to them. Fire was the possession of the gods, kept in Zeus's palace on Olympus, and humans were forbidden its use. But Prometheus, whose name means forethought, could see what humanity might become with this tool. And so he committed an act of defiance that would echo through all of Western literature as the archetype of rebellion in the name of compassion. Prometheus stole fire from the gods. He hid it in a hollow fennel stalk and brought it down from Olympus to the mortal world. And with fire came everything. The ability to cook food, to forge metal, to create pottery, to light the darkness, to warm the cold. With fire came civilization itself, the foundation upon which all human achievement would be built. The humans rejoiced, and suddenly their world transformed. They were no longer merely clever animals, but something new, something that could shape their environment rather than simply endure it. But Zeus was furious. The king of the gods saw in this theft not just disobedience but a fundamental challenge to the cosmic order. If humans could wield fire, what would they attempt next? Where would their ambition end? And so Zeus decreed a punishment for Prometheus that was meant to last for eternity. He had the Titan chained to a rock in the Caucasus Mountains, exposed to the elements, unable to move or escape. And each day, an eagle, some say it was sent by Zeus himself, would come and tear open Prometheus's belly, devouring his liver. Each night, because Prometheus was immortal, his liver would regenerate, healing completely. And each dawn, the eagle would return to begin the torture anew. Can you imagine it? The endless cycle, the pain renewed each morning, the knowledge that there would be no escape, no end, no mercy. Yet Prometheus endured, and he did not recant. He knew a secret that even Zeus did not know, a prophecy about Zeus's own eventual downfall, but he would not reveal it, not even to buy his freedom from suffering. His rebellion was not merely a moment of defiance but a sustained act of will, a refusal to submit even in the face of infinite punishment. But Zeus's vengeance was not complete. He decided that humanity itself must also be punished for accepting the stolen fire. And so he conceived a plan of such subtlety that it reveals the complexity of Greek moral thought. Zeus commanded Hephaestus to fashion a woman from clay, the first woman who had ever existed, for up until this point humanity had been only men, reproducing through some means the myths do not clearly explain. Hephaestus crafted her with all his skill, making her beautiful beyond measure. Each of the gods gave her a gift. Aphrodite gave her beauty, Athena taught her weaving and crafts, Hermes gave her cunning and persuasive speech. They dressed her in finery and adorned her with jewels, and they named her Pandora, which means all-gifted, for she had received gifts from all the Olympians. Zeus presented Pandora to Epimetheus, Prometheus's brother, the Titan of afterthought who always understood things too late. Prometheus had warned Epimetheus never to accept gifts from Zeus, but Epimetheus, dazzled by Pandora's beauty, ignored his brother's advice. He welcomed her into his home, and with her came a sealed jar, often mistranslated as a box in later tradition, but originally a large jar called a pithos, the kind used for storing grain or wine. Zeus had warned Pandora never to open this jar, and of course, this warning ensured that eventually she would do exactly that. Curiosity is not a flaw in Greek myth so much as a defining characteristic of consciousness itself, the drive to know, to understand, to peer beyond the boundaries we are given. And so one day, alone with the jar, Pandora's curiosity overcame her obedience. She lifted the lid, just a crack, just to peek inside. And out rushed all the evils that would forever plague humanity, disease and death, old age and pain, envy and spite, hatred and war, all the sufferings that make mortal life difficult and heartbreaking. They burst from the jar like a dark wind and spread across the world, infecting everything they touched. Pandora, horrified, slammed the lid back down, but it was too late. The evils were loose, never to be recaptured. Yet one thing remained inside the jar, trapped when Pandora closed the lid. Hope. Elpis, the Greeks called it, and its presence in the jar with all those evils has puzzled interpreters for thousands of years. Was hope the final evil, a false comfort that keeps humans going through suffering that might be better ended? Or was it the one gift that makes all the others bearable, the light that allows us to continue even in darkness? The Greeks, in their wisdom, did not provide a definitive answer. They let the ambiguity stand, understanding that hope itself is ambiguous, both blessing and curse, sustaining and tormenting by turns. So humanity received fire, and with it came suffering. Prometheus gave us the means to build civilization, and Zeus ensured that this civilization would be built on the foundation of pain and loss. It is a profoundly Greek insight. That progress and suffering are intertwined, that the very gifts that elevate us also burden us, that consciousness and mortality dance together in an embrace that is both beautiful and terrible. But let us drift now from these cosmic dramas to more intimate stories, for mythology lives not only in the great sweeping movements of divine history but also in the individual tales that capture something essential about the human heart. Let us speak of love, for the Greeks understood that love, more than any other force, drives the actions of both gods and mortals, creating beauty and destruction in equal measure. Aphrodite, born from sea foam, risen from violence yet embodying beauty, was the undisputed goddess of love in all its forms, erotic passion, tender affection, the binding force that draws beings together. Her power was so great that even Zeus, king of the gods, fell under her sway repeatedly, his numerous affairs a testament to desire's ability to override judgment. But Aphrodite's own love life was complicated, a divine soap opera that reveals how the Greeks thought about passion and marriage, duty and desire. She was married to Hephaestus, the smith god, in what was arranged as a diplomatic marriage. Hephaestus, remember, had been cast from Olympus by Hera for being lame, and he had his revenge by crafting a magical throne that trapped her when she sat in it. Zeus, to free his wife, had to promise Hephaestus the hand of Aphrodite, the most beautiful of all the goddesses. So Hephaestus, ugly and limping, became husband to beauty incarnate. It was not a match made for happiness, and Aphrodite, goddess of passion, would not be constrained by vows she had not chosen. Her lover was Ares, the god of war, and their affair speaks to something the Greeks recognized, the connection between love and conflict, passion and violence, the way the heart at its most intense can feel like a battlefield. Ares was everything Hephaestus was not: strong, handsome, vital, but he was also brutal, thoughtless, the kind of passionate intensity that burns rather than warms. Yet Aphrodite was drawn to him, and they would meet in secret, stealing moments of pleasure while Hephaestus labored at his forge. But Hephaestus was not so easily fooled. Helios, the all-seeing sun, observed the lovers' tryst and reported it to the wronged husband. Hephaestus, with the same ingenuity he brought to all his crafts, fashioned a trap, a net of bronze so fine it was invisible, so strong it could not be broken. He arranged it over the bed where Aphrodite and Ares met, and when next the lovers came together, lost in passion, the net fell upon them, binding them in an embrace they could not escape. Then Hephaestus called all the gods to witness his wife's infidelity. The goddesses, out of modesty or perhaps solidarity, refused to come, but the gods all arrived, and their reaction tells us something about Greek attitudes toward these matters. They did not gasp in horror or condemn Aphrodite. Instead, they laughed. Apollo joked to Hermes that he would gladly suffer the embarrassment of being caught in such a net for the chance to lie with Aphrodite. The whole scene became comedy rather than tragedy, and eventually Poseidon convinced Hephaestus to release the lovers, promising that Ares would pay appropriate compensation. Aphrodite returned to her sacred island of Cyprus to bathe and restore her dignity. Ares slunk away to his beloved Thrace, land of warriors. And Hephaestus went back to his forge, his point made even if his marriage was not restored. It is a very human story, this divine infidelity, the triangle of the wronged spouse, the beautiful partner, and the passionate lover. The Greeks told it not to moralize but to recognize. This is how things are, how desire operates, how even gods are subject to forces they cannot fully control. From the union of Aphrodite and Ares came several children who embodied different aspects of their parents' natures: Harmonia, goddess of harmony, a balance between love and war; Phobos and Deimos, fear and panic, the terrors of battle; and Eros, though in some traditions Eros is much older, one of the primordial forces present at creation itself. This younger Eros was the god of erotic love, often depicted as a mischievous child or a beautiful youth with wings, carrying bow and arrows that he would shoot into the hearts of gods and mortals alike, causing them to fall helplessly in love, sometimes appropriately, sometimes disastrously. It was Eros who would play a role in one of mythology's most beautiful love stories, the tale of Psyche. Psyche was a mortal princess, so beautiful that people began to worship her instead of Aphrodite, comparing her favorably to the goddess herself. You can imagine how well Aphrodite took this. The goddess of beauty does not appreciate competition, especially not from a mortal. In her jealousy and wounded pride, Aphrodite called her son Eros to her and commanded him to make Psyche fall in love with the most wretched, vile creature he could find, someone completely unworthy of her beauty. Eros took his golden arrows, the ones that cause irresistible love, and flew to where Psyche slept. But when he saw her, when he beheld her beauty for himself, he was startled, and in his surprise, he pricked himself with his own arrow. The god of love fell in love, helplessly, completely, with the mortal girl sleeping before him. And he could not bring himself to curse her as his mother had commanded. Instead, Eros arranged things differently. He went to the oracle at Delphi, that sacred site where Apollo's priestess spoke prophecies that shaped destinies, and he ensured that when Psyche's father came to ask about his daughter's future, the oracle would give a strange and frightening response. The oracle declared that Psyche must be dressed as a bride and taken to a mountain peak, where she would wed not a mortal but a terrible serpent, a creature of divine origin whom even the gods feared. Imagine poor Psyche, dressed in bridal garments but attending what seemed like her own funeral, led in procession to an isolated mountain peak and left there alone. She stood weeping, waiting for the monster that would claim her. But instead of death, she felt a gentle breeze, the west wind Zephyrus, lifting her carefully, carrying her down from the peak to a hidden valley where a magnificent palace waited, more beautiful than anything she had ever imagined. The palace was deserted, or so it seemed, though invisible servants attended to her every need. Disembodied voices offered her food, music, companionship. She lived in luxury, wanting for nothing. And at night, in darkness so complete she could see nothing, her husband came to her. His voice was gentle, his touch tender, his presence reassuring. He made love to her with such care and passion that she felt deeply cherished. But he made her promise one thing. She must never try to see his face, never light a lamp to look upon him. If she broke this promise, he warned, she would lose him forever. For a time, Psyche was content. She loved the voice in the darkness, the gentle presence of her mysterious husband. But she had sisters, older and jealous, who came to visit and found her living in such splendor. They could not believe her story of a husband she had never seen, and they planted seeds of doubt and fear in her mind. What if the oracle's prophecy was true? What if she was sleeping each night with a monster, something so hideous he dared not show himself? They convinced her that she should light a lamp while he slept, and if he truly was a monster, she should kill him before he killed her. That night, Psyche lay awake, her heart pounding, until she was certain her husband slept. Then she rose quietly and lit an oil lamp, carrying it to the bed to look upon him for the first time. The lamplight fell across his face, and Psyche gasped, nearly dropping the lamp. For there, sleeping peacefully, was no monster but the most beautiful being she had ever seen, a youth with golden wings folded at his back, his face perfect in its symmetry, his expression tender even in sleep. This was Eros himself, god of love, her husband. But as she stood transfixed, her hand trembling, a drop of hot oil fell from the lamp onto Eros's shoulder. He woke with a cry of pain, saw immediately what had happened, saw the broken trust in her eyes even as she saw the betrayal reflected in his. Without a word, he spread his wings and flew away, disappearing into the night sky, leaving Psyche alone in the palace that would now seem empty without him. Psyche's heart broke. She had found love and lost it through her own doubt, her inability to trust in what she could not see. Desperate to win him back, she searched everywhere for Eros, wandering the world, asking every god and goddess she encountered if they had seen him. Most turned her away, unwilling to offend Aphrodite by helping the girl who had supplanted her in mortal worship. Finally, Having nowhere else to turn, Psyche came to Aphrodite's temple and threw herself on the goddess's mercy. Aphrodite, still angry, agreed to help only if Psyche could complete a series of tasks, labors she designed to be impossible. First, she poured out a great mixed heap of different grains, wheat, barley, millet, lentils, all jumbled together, and commanded Psyche to sort them before nightfall. Psyche sat before the impossible pile, tears streaming down her face. But ants, touched by her sorrow or perhaps commanded by Eros watching from afar, came in their thousands and sorted the grains perfectly, each type in its own neat mound. For her second task, Aphrodite sent Psyche to gather golden fleece from a flock of man-eating sheep that guarded it viciously. Psyche went to the river where the sheep grazed, ready to risk death, but a reed growing by the riverbank whispered advice. Wait until afternoon when the sheep rest in the shade, then gather fleece from the brambles where it catches, avoiding the dangerous animals directly. Psyche followed this advice and succeeded. The third task was to fill a crystal flask with water from the river Styx where it tumbles down from an impossibly high, treacherous cliff, guarded by serpents and dragons. This seemed truly impossible, but Zeus's eagle, perhaps remembering how Prometheus had helped create humanity and pitying Psyche's devotion, swooped down, took the flask in its talons, filled it, and returned it to her. For the final task, Aphrodite commanded Psyche to descend into the underworld itself and ask Persephone, queen of the dead, for a small amount of her beauty in a box, which Psyche must bring back without opening. This was meant to be fatal. The journey to the underworld and back is one few mortals ever made. But Psyche found a tower that told her how to make the journey. She must take coins to pay the ferryman Charon, cakes to appease the three-headed dog Cerberus, and most importantly, she must resist all temptations to help those suffering along the way, for these would be traps to delay her and ensure she stayed in the realm of the dead forever. Psyche followed these instructions precisely. She descended into Hades's realm, that gray and misty place where the dead drift like shadows, forever separated from the light and warmth of life. She paid Charon to ferry her across the river Styx, gave Cerberus his cake to let her pass, resisted the pleas of spirits asking for help. She came before Persephone, that goddess who spends half the year in the underworld with her husband Hades and half the year on earth with her mother Demeter, bringing spring in her wake. Persephone, perhaps sympathizing with the young woman in love, gave Psyche the box of beauty and sent her back to the surface. But as Psyche climbed toward the light, toward life, she thought about what she was carrying. A box of divine beauty from the queen of the underworld. She had been through so much, suffered so many trials. She had lost Eros because she was merely mortal, merely human. Perhaps if she took just a little of this beauty for herself, she would be more worthy of him, more able to win him back. And so, though she had been warned not to open the box, she lifted the lid. There was no beauty inside. Instead, a deathly sleep escaped, the sleep of the underworld, and it overcame Psyche immediately. She fell to the ground, neither alive nor dead, frozen in a sleep from which no mortal could wake. But Eros, who had been recovering from his burn and his heartbreak, could not stay away from her any longer. He had been watching her trials from afar, suffering as she suffered, proud of her persistence. When he saw her fall, he flew to her side. He wiped the sleep from her face, putting it back in the box, and touched her with one of his arrows. Psyche woke to find him there, and this time there was no darkness between them, no uncertainty, only the clear light of love that had survived testing. Eros took her to Olympus, and there he pleaded with Zeus to make Psyche immortal so they could truly be together forever. Zeus, moved by their love, agreed. He gave Psyche ambrosia, the food of the gods, and she became divine, taking her place among the immortals. Aphrodite, seeing the depth of their devotion, relented at last, and the marriage was celebrated properly, with all the gods in attendance. From the union of Eros and Psyche came a daughter named Hedone, goddess of pleasure, and the tale itself became something more than just a story. It became an allegory that philosophers would ponder for centuries. For you see, psyche in Greek means soul, and the story of the soul's journey through trials, through darkness and doubt, toward union with love itself, spoke to something profound about the human condition. The Greeks understood that love required trust, that it demanded we embrace what we cannot fully see or control, and that the greatest loves often ask us to descend into our own underworlds, to face impossible tasks, before we can claim the happiness that awaits on the other side. But not all love stories in Greek mythology ended with such grace. For every tale of devotion rewarded, there were many more of love denied, twisted, or destroyed by circumstance, pride, or the jealousy of the gods. Consider the story of Echo and Narcissus, a tale that speaks to the dangers of self-absorption and the tragedy of unrequited love. Echo was a beautiful nymph, one of those nature spirits who inhabited the wild places of Greece, living in mountains and forests, dancing in streams, generally keeping company with Artemis and her band of virgin huntresses. But Echo had one particular talent that would prove her undoing. She was remarkably talkative, gifted with conversation, able to keep anyone entertained with her stories and chatter for hours on end. Hera, queen of the gods, knew that her husband Zeus was perpetually unfaithful, always sneaking away from Olympus to pursue nymphs and mortal women. She would try to catch him in the act, to confront him with evidence of his betrayals. But Echo, whether out of loyalty to Zeus or simply enjoying the conspiracy, would waylay Hera with conversation whenever Zeus was with other nymphs. She would engage the goddess in long, distracting discussions until Zeus had time to conclude his affairs and return to Olympus as if nothing had happened. Eventually, Hera realized what Echo was doing, and the queen of the gods was not one to forgive such deception. Her punishment was cruel in its precision. Echo would never again speak her own words. She could only repeat the last words spoken by others, condemned to echo what she heard, never able to initiate conversation, to express her own thoughts, to say the things that filled her heart. For someone whose gift had been eloquence, it was a devastating curse. Echo retreated into the forests, isolated by her inability to communicate, and it was there that she saw Narcissus. He was a youth of extraordinary beauty, son of the river god Cephissus and the nymph Liriope. When he was born, his mother had consulted the prophet Tiresias, asking if her son would live a long life. Tiresias, who could see the future, gave a cryptic answer: if he never knows himself. But what this meant would only become clear much later. Narcissus grew into a young man so beautiful that everyone who saw him fell in love. Nymphs, mortals, even some of the gods cast longing glances his way. But Narcissus was proud, cold, indifferent to all who desired him. He rejected every advance, every confession of love, taking pleasure in his own perfection but unable or unwilling to see value in others. Echo saw him hunting in the forest and fell immediately, helplessly in love. She followed him through the trees, desperate to approach him but unable to speak first, trapped by Hera's curse. Finally, Narcissus, sensing he was being followed, called out, "Is anyone there?" And Echo could only repeat, "There." "Come to me," Narcissus called. "Come to me," Echo answered, her heart surging with hope as she emerged from the trees and tried to embrace him. But Narcissus recoiled in disgust. "Away with these encircling arms," he said cruelly. "I would die before I would give you power over me." "I would give you power over me," Echo repeated, but he was already running away, leaving her alone with words that were not her own. Echo, heartbroken, wasted away. She could not eat, could not sleep, consumed by grief and rejected love. Her flesh faded, her bones turned to stone, until nothing remained but her voice, forever hidden in caves and mountains, repeating the words of others, a bodiless sound carrying the pain of love refused. But the gods take note of cruelty, and Nemesis, goddess of retribution, decided that Narcissus must learn what it meant to love without hope of fulfillment. One day, After hunting, Narcissus came upon a perfectly still pool, its surface like polished silver, untouched by wind or falling leaves. He knelt to drink, and in the water he saw a face of such extraordinary beauty that he was transfixed. The face looked back at him with eyes full of longing. When he reached toward it, it reached toward him. When he smiled, it smiled back. Narcissus had fallen in love with his own reflection, though he did not realize it. He thought he had discovered another person, someone as beautiful as himself, finally someone worthy of his affection. He tried to kiss the face in the water, but it dissolved under his touch. He tried to embrace it, but his arms went through it, finding only cold water. He sat back, and the face returned, gazing at him with what seemed like love. He could not leave. Day after day, Narcissus lay by the pool, staring at the reflection, trying to reach something that was simultaneously himself and forever beyond his grasp. He stopped eating, stopped drinking, wasting away just as Echo had wasted away for him. Finally, understanding dawned. "Oh," he whispered to his reflection, "you are me. This love is impossible." And with that realization, the prophecy was fulfilled. He had come to know himself, and it destroyed him. Narcissus died there by the pool, and where his body lay, a flower sprang up, white petals surrounding a golden center, forever bending toward water, forever seeking its own reflection. We call it the narcissus still, a flower that blooms in spring, beautiful and self-contained, a memorial to the danger of loving only what we see in the mirror. The nymphs mourned him, and even the gods felt the waste of it, such beauty destroyed by pride and self-absorption. And somewhere in the mountains, Echo's voice repeated their mourning cries, the last testament to her unrequited love. These stories of love's difficulties run like dark threads through the bright tapestry of myth, reminding us that the Greeks did not sentimentalize romance. They understood that love could be as destructive as it was creative, that desire could lead to ruin as easily as to happiness, that the human heart was complex and often contradictory. Consider Apollo, god of light and reason, who suffered some of mythology's most famous romantic failures. For all his perfection, all his gifts, Apollo repeatedly found himself rejected by those he loved. His first great love was Daphne, a nymph who served Artemis and, like the virgin goddess herself, had sworn off romance and marriage, preferring the freedom of the hunt to the bonds of love. Apollo had mocked Eros once, seeing the god of love practicing with his bow and arrows, playfully disparaging his archery skills. Eros, insulted, decided to teach the proud god a lesson. He took 2 arrows from his quiver. One tipped with gold that caused instant, irresistible love, and one tipped with lead that caused instant, complete aversion. The golden arrow he shot into Apollo's heart. The lead arrow he shot into Daphne's heart. The effect was immediate. Apollo saw Daphne running through the forest and fell instantly, overwhelmingly in love. She was everything to him, her grace, her freedom, her wildness. He called out to her, proclaimed his love, began to chase her. But Daphne, struck by the lead arrow, felt only horror at his approach. She ran faster, her heart pounding not with love but with fear and aversion. Apollo chased her through the forests, over hills, along streams, and he called out as he ran, trying to explain that he meant her no harm, that he loved her, that she had no reason to fear. He listed his accomplishments, his mastery of music, his gift of prophecy, his divine heritage. But Daphne only ran faster, desperate to escape. Finally, exhausted, knowing she could not outrun a god forever, Daphne saw the river of her father, the river god Peneus, flowing before her. She cried out to him, "Father, help me. If you have power, destroy this beauty that makes me hunted. Transform me, save me, let me escape this pursuit." The gods heard her prayer. As Apollo's hands reached out to grasp her, Daphne's skin became bark, Her arms stretched into branches, her feet grew roots that dug deep into the earth, her hair became leaves rustling in the wind. In moments where Daphne had stood, there was now a laurel tree, beautiful and untouchable. Apollo embraced the tree, felt the trunk where her heart would be, still beating beneath the bark. He wept, understanding that he had lost her, that his love had driven her to this desperate transformation. "If you cannot be my wife," he said softly, "at least be my tree. I will wear your leaves as a crown. I will honor you forever." And from that day, the laurel became Apollo's sacred tree, its leaves woven into crowns for victors and poets, a beautiful symbol born from love's failure. Apollo's romantic misfortunes continued throughout mythology. He loved Cassandra, a Trojan princess, and gave her the gift of prophecy to win her heart. But when she still refused him, he cursed her so that though she would see the future truly, no one would ever believe her prophecies, a curse that would make her later warnings about the Trojan horse fall on deaf ears. He loved the Spartan prince Hyacinthus, and that love ended in tragedy when a discus Apollo threw was blown off course by the jealous wind god Zephyrus, killing the beautiful youth. Where Hyacinthus's blood fell, the flower that bears his name sprang up, its petals marked with what looked like the letters of a cry of grief. Even the gods, it seemed, could not command love, could not make it come when they wished or go where they directed it. Love had its own logic, its own will, and even divine power could not control it completely. But let us turn from these melancholy tales to the story of a love that, while complicated and strange by our standards, endured and shaped the very seasons of the earth. This is the story of Demeter and Persephone, of a mother's love for her daughter, and of the compromise that keeps the world balanced between growth and death, summer and winter. Demeter, goddess of the harvest, of grain and growing things, had one daughter, Persephone, whom she loved more than anything in creation. Persephone was springtime itself, young, beautiful, innocent, gathering flowers in meadows, laughing with the nymphs, embodying all the joy and promise of youth. Demeter kept her daughter close, protective, perhaps overprotective, wanting to preserve her innocence forever. But Hades, god of the underworld, saw Persephone dancing in a field and fell deeply in love. Hades rarely left his dark kingdom, it was a lonely position, ruling over the dead, and no goddess wanted to share his shadowy throne. But Persephone, full of life and light, captivated him entirely. He went to Zeus, his brother, and asked for Persephone's hand in marriage. Zeus, caught in an impossible position, gave his permission. As king of the gods, he could see that the match made political sense, uniting the realms of earth and underworld. But he knew Demeter would never agree, would never willingly send her daughter into the darkness beneath the earth. And so Zeus told Hades to take Persephone, to carry her away, and they would deal with Demeter's anger afterward. One day, Persephone was gathering flowers with her companions in a meadow. She wandered a little apart from the others, drawn by a particularly beautiful narcissus, that same flower that had sprung from the death of Narcissus, its beauty still luring the unwary. As she bent to pick it, the earth suddenly split open before her. Up from the chasm came a chariot pulled by black horses, driven by a figure cloaked in darkness. Hades seized Persephone before she could even scream, pulled her into the chariot, and plunged back into the earth. The ground sealed behind them, leaving only the scattered flowers as evidence that anything had happened. Persephone's cries echoed through the underworld as Hades carried her down to his palace, past the river Styx where the souls of the dead waited for judgment, past the three-headed dog Cerberus who guarded the gates, into the vast halls where no sunlight ever reached. Hades tried to be gentle, tried to explain his love, offered her every luxury his kingdom could provide. He was not cruel, not violent. He simply could not understand why she would not accept him, why she wept and refused to eat, why she longed for the upper world. Meanwhile, Demeter heard her daughter's distant scream and came running. She found the scattered flowers, the nymphs who had seen nothing, and no trace of Persephone. Immediately, Demeter began to search. She lit torches from Mount Etna and wandered the earth for 9 days and 9 nights without rest, asking everyone she met if they had seen her daughter. Gods, mortals, animals, none could tell her what had happened. Her grief grew with each passing hour, and as she grieved, the earth began to mirror her sorrow. On the 10th day, Demeter encountered Hecate, goddess of crossroads and magic, who had heard Persephone's cry but had not seen who took her. Together they went to Helios, the sun, who sees everything that happens beneath his light. Helios, pitying the goddess's anguish, told her the truth. Zeus had given Persephone to Hades, and she was now in the underworld, queen of the dead. Demeter's grief turned to rage. She felt utterly betrayed, by Zeus who had given away her daughter without asking her, by Hades who had stolen the girl, by all the male gods who had conspired to take the person she loved most. In her fury and sorrow, Demeter abandoned her divine duties. She disguised herself as an old woman and wandered among mortals, and without her blessing, nothing would grow. The earth became barren. Seeds planted in the ground refused to sprout. Trees bore no fruit. Crops withered in the fields. Animals grew thin and died. Mortals began to starve, and with no harvests, they could not make the sacrifices that honored the gods. The other gods began to feel the absence of worship, the emptiness of altars where once offerings had been plentiful. Demeter came to Eleusis, a city near Athens, and there she was welcomed into the household of the king, though they did not know she was a goddess. She became nursemaid to the queen's infant son, and in her grief she developed a strange affection for the child. She decided to make him immortal, to give him the gift that would protect him from the suffering she now knew too well. Each night she placed the baby in the fire, burning away his mortal parts, intending to make him divine. But the queen, watching secretly, saw what appeared to be a mad old woman putting her baby in the fire and screamed in horror. Demeter, interrupted, revealed herself in her true divine form, radiant and terrible. The queen and all the household fell to their knees in terror. Demeter told them she had meant only good for the child, but the process was now ruined. Instead, she instructed them to build her a great temple in Eleusis, and there she would teach them mysteries, sacred rites that would help mortals understand the cycle of life and death. The temple was built, and Demeter withdrew into it, still refusing to let anything grow, still mourning her lost daughter. The earth continued to die. Finally, Zeus realized that something had to be done. If the mortals all starved, the gods would have no worshippers. And Demeter, in her grief, was powerful enough that even he could not simply command her to resume her duties. Zeus sent Hermes, the messenger god, down to the underworld with orders for Hades to release Persephone. Hades, seeing that he had no choice, agreed, but with cunning. Before Persephone left, he offered her a pomegranate, and she, not thinking clearly after so long in darkness, ate 6 seeds from it. This was crucial, for there was an ancient law. Anyone who ate food in the underworld was bound to it forever. Persephone had not eaten during her entire captivity, sustaining herself on grief and hope, but at the last moment, with freedom in sight, she had consumed those 6 seeds. Some versions say Hades tricked her. Others say she knew what she was doing, that in her time below she had seen another side of him, had begun to understand the necessary role death plays in existence, and had chosen to bind herself partly to his world. Hermes brought Persephone back to the surface, and when Demeter saw her daughter, her joy was immeasurable. They embraced, they wept, they could not let each other go. But when Demeter learned about the pomegranate seeds, her heart sank. The law was clear, Persephone could not return permanently to the upper world. Zeus proposed a compromise. Because Persephone had eaten 6 seeds, she would spend 6 months of each year in the underworld as Hades' queen, and 6 months on earth with her mother. Some versions say it was 4 months below and 8 above, the proportions varying, but the pattern was the same. And so the cycle was established. When Persephone descends to the underworld each year, Demeter mourns and withdraws her blessing from the earth. This is autumn and winter, when leaves fall, plants die back, and the world grows cold and dark. But when Persephone returns to her mother each spring, Demeter's joy causes everything to bloom again. This is spring and summer, the time of growth and warmth and life. Persephone herself changed through this arrangement. She was no longer just the innocent maiden picking flowers. She became something dual, something complex, springtime and death, maiden and queen, holding in herself the understanding that life and death are not opposites but partners in an eternal dance. In the underworld, she ruled with wisdom and sometimes mercy, interceding for certain souls, granting requests to heroes who braved the land of the dead. She was the dread Persephone, queen of ghosts, and also Kore, the maiden, daughter of the harvest. The mysteries that Demeter established at Eleusis became some of the most important religious rites in ancient Greece. Initiates would undergo secret ceremonies that revealed truths about death and rebirth, about the cycle that Persephone embodied. Those who participated in the Eleusinian mystery spoke of losing their fear of death, of understanding that just as seeds must be buried in dark earth to sprout again, so too might human souls undergo transformation after death. But the initiates were sworn to secrecy, and the exact nature of what they experienced has never been revealed. It remains one of history's most closely kept secrets, a silence preserved for nearly 2,000 years until the mysteries finally ended with the rise of Christianity. This story of Demeter and Persephone spoke to something deep in the Greek experience. It explained the seasons, yes, but it also explored the pain of separation, the necessity of letting go, the way that children must leave their parents and enter worlds their mothers cannot follow them into. It acknowledged that love between mother and daughter is one of the most powerful bonds, and yet even that bond must bend to accommodate growth and change and the larger patterns of existence. Not all the transformations in Greek mythology were as willing as Persephone's acceptance of her dual role. Many myths involve metamorphosis, sudden, dramatic changes of form inflicted by angry gods or undertaken in desperation. These transformation stories speak to the Greek understanding that identity is not fixed, that under extreme pressure or divine intervention, the very nature of a being can shift, and what was human can become animal, plant, or even something stranger. Take the story of Arachne, a young woman from Lydia who was extraordinarily skilled at weaving. Her tapestries were so beautiful that people came from all over to watch her work, to see her fingers fly across the loom, creating scenes so lifelike they seemed to breathe. People began to say that surely Arachne must have been taught by Athena herself, goddess of crafts and weaving. But Arachne, proud of her skill, insisted that she owed nothing to Athena, that her talent was entirely her own. "I would challenge Athena herself," she boasted, "and I would win." Such hubris could not go unanswered. Athena, goddess of wisdom but also capable of considerable pride herself, disguised herself as an old woman and came to Arachne, advising her to be more humble, to honor the gods who gave humans their gifts. Arachne scoffed at the old woman's advice, and Athena, revealing herself in her true form, accepted the challenge. They set up 2 looms side by side, and both began to weave. Athena created a tapestry showing the glory of the gods, their victories, their majesty, and at each corner she wove scenes of mortals who had challenged the gods and been punished for their presumption, a warning that Arachne chose not to heed. Arachne, for her part, wove a tapestry showing the gods' misdeeds, all of Zeus's transformations and deceptions as he pursued mortal women, Zeus as a bull carrying off Europa, as a swan with Leda, as a shower of gold with Danae. Her work exposed the gods' hypocrisy, their abuse of power, their casual cruelty toward mortals. And her technical skill was flawless, even Athena could not find fault with the weaving itself. But the content enraged the goddess. Here was a mortal not only matching her skill but using it to mock the gods themselves. In her fury, Athena tore Arachne's tapestry to shreds and struck her with the shuttle from the loom. Arachne, devastated and humiliated, tried to hang herself. But Athena would not let her escape through death. Instead, she sprinkled her with a potion made from the juices of a magical herb, and Arachne's body began to shrink and transform. Her arms and legs became thin and long, her body contracted to a small round form, and from her abdomen she began to spin thread, no longer on a loom but from her own substance. Athena had turned her into a spider, condemned to weave forever, her magnificent art reduced to creating webs in corners and eaves, to be swept away without a second thought, her name, Arachne, becoming the root of the word for a new form, arachnid. It is a harsh tale, revealing the danger of challenging divine power, but also perhaps suggesting something about the relationship between artist and craft, the way that sometimes we can become so consumed by our work that we lose our human form entirely, becoming nothing but the act of creation itself. Another transformation, gentler but no less complete, befell Philemon and Baucis, an elderly couple who lived in poverty in the hills of Phrygia. Their story speaks to the Greek value of hospitality, xenia, the sacred duty to welcome strangers, for you never knew when a stranger might be a god in disguise. Zeus and Hermes, wanting to test the piety of mortals, disguised themselves as weary travelers and went from house to house in a wealthy district, asking for food and shelter. Every door was slammed in their faces. The rich citizens wanted nothing to do with poor travelers, saw them as nuisances, threats, or simply beneath their notice. Finally, the two gods climbed to a poor cottage on a hillside, the humblest dwelling in the region. Here lived Philemon and Baucis, married for decades, grown old together in poverty but rich in love and contentment. When the strangers knocked, the elderly couple welcomed them immediately, brought them inside, offered them the best seats by the fire. The couple had almost nothing, but they shared it gladly. Baucis cooked their last vegetables, and Philemon brought out their small store of wine. As the evening progressed, they noticed something odd. No matter how much wine they poured, the pitcher never emptied. It refilled itself magically, and the elderly couple realized with growing awe that their guests were not ordinary travelers. Zeus and Hermes revealed themselves, and Zeus declared that Philemon and Baucis would be rewarded while the inhospitable neighbors would be punished. He told the couple to follow him up the mountain, not looking back. As they climbed, they heard behind them a terrible sound like thunder and rushing water. When they finally reached the peak and turned around, they saw that the entire valley had become a lake. All those homes that had turned away strangers were now beneath the water. Only their own humble cottage remained, but as they watched, it transformed into a magnificent temple. Zeus granted them one wish. Philemon and Baucis, holding hands, asked only that they might serve as priest and priestess of this temple, and that when their time came to die, they might die together, neither having to endure life without the other. The gods granted this wish. For many years, Philemon and Baucis tended the temple, welcoming travelers, showing the hospitality that had saved them. And when they were very old, standing together before the temple one day, they noticed bark beginning to grow up their legs. They embraced, declaring their love one final time, and the transformation completed. Philemon became an oak tree, Baucis became a linden, and their branches intertwined above the temple, inseparable in death as they had been in life. Travelers would come to the temple for generations afterward, placing wreaths on the two trees, honoring the couple whose love and kindness had transcended even the boundary between human and plant, whose story reminded everyone that true wealth lies not in gold but in generosity of spirit. These transformation stories operated on multiple levels in Greek mythology. On one level, they explained natural phenomena. Why spiders weave, why certain trees grow intertwined, why narcissus flowers bend toward water. On another level, they were moral tales about pride, love, punishment, and reward. But on perhaps the deepest level, they reflected the Greek understanding that identity is fluid, that under the surface of our human forms lies the potential for radical change, that we are always closer than we think to becoming something entirely other. The gods themselves were shapeshifters, particularly Zeus, whose transformations in pursuit of mortal women became a recurring theme in mythology. These stories are deeply problematic by modern standards, often describing what we would recognize as divine assault, but they were part of how the Greeks explained the origins of many heroes and royal lineages. Nearly every significant family claimed divine ancestry, usually through Zeus, and these transformation stories provided the narratives that connected heaven and earth, God and mortal. Zeus transformed himself into a shower of gold to reach Danae, locked in a bronze chamber by her father who feared a prophecy that her son would kill him. From this union came Perseus, who would indeed eventually fulfill the prophecy. Zeus became a bull to carry off Europa, a Phoenician princess, swimming with her on his back to Crete where she would give birth to Minos, who became the great king of Crete. As a swan, Zeus came to Leda, and from the eggs she laid came Helen of Troy and the Dioscuri twins, Castor and Pollux. These transformations served practical purposes in the stories. They explained how gods could access mortals kept under guard, how divine conception could occur. But they also suggested something about the nature of divinity itself, that the gods were not bound by physical form, that they could be anything, appear as anything, penetrate any barrier. The very malleability of divine form spoke to a worldview where boundaries between categories, God and animal, human and beast, living and dead, were permeable, negotiable, subject to forces beyond mortal comprehension. This fluidity extended to the demigods, those heroes born from divine mortal unions, who walked the earth with one foot in heaven and one in the dust, embodying the possibility and peril of crossing between worlds. Let us turn now to these heroes, for in them the myths become most intensely human, most urgently concerned with the questions that have troubled our kind since we first gained consciousness. The heroes are mortal, or mostly mortal, and thus they face death, failure, the consequences of their choices in ways the deathless gods never can. In their stories, we find not cosmic creation or divine romance, but the fundamental questions: what does it mean to be brave? How do we face impossible odds? Can we escape our fates, or must we walk toward them with open eyes? What do we owe to our families, our cities, ourselves? The greatest of all Greek heroes, the one whose name became synonymous with strength and endurance, was Heracles, or Hercules, as the Romans later called him. His story begins with Zeus's desire for Alcmene, a mortal woman of extraordinary virtue, married to Amphitryon. Zeus took Amphitrion's form and came to Alcmene while her husband was away at war. In that single night, both Zeus and the returning Amphitryon lay with Alcmene, and she conceived twins, one divine, one mortal. The divine child was Heracles. But Hera, Zeus's wife, had reached the limit of her tolerance for her husband's infidelities. She could not punish Zeus directly, he was too powerful, but she could make the life of his illegitimate son a torment from birth to death. When Heracles was still an infant, lying in his cradle with his mortal twin brother Iphicles, Hera sent two enormous serpents to kill them. Iphicles screamed in terror, but baby Heracles reached out with his chubby hands and strangled both serpents, one in each fist, already showing the superhuman strength that would define his life. Heracles grew into a man of tremendous power and size, trained by the greatest teachers in all the arts of war and civilization. But Hera's persecution continued. When Heracles married Megara, princess of Thebes, and had children with her, building what seemed like a happy domestic life, Hera struck him with a sudden madness. In his delirium, unable to distinguish reality from hallucination, Heracles believed his wife and children were enemies and killed them all with his own hands. When the madness lifted and Heracles saw what he had done, his grief was overwhelming. He wanted to die, to end himself and his curse. But his friend Theseus, another great hero whom we will come to shortly, persuaded him that suicide would be cowardice, that he must live with what he had done and seek purification. Heracles went to the oracle at Delphi, asking how he might atone for his terrible crime. The oracle told him to go to his cousin Eurystheus, king of Mycenae, and serve him for 12 years, performing whatever labors Eurystheus demanded. This was Hera's design, working through the oracle, for Eurystheus was a coward who resented Heracles' strength, and Hera whispered in his ear, suggesting tasks that were meant to be impossible, meant to kill even the mighty Heracles. And so began the 12 labors, the trials that would define Heracles and become the template for hero stories throughout Western literature. Each labor seemed impossible, each required not only strength but cunning, perseverance, the ability to solve problems that had no obvious solution. First, Eurystheus sent Heracles to kill the Nemean lion, a beast with hide so thick that no weapon could pierce it. The lion had been terrorizing the countryside around Nemea, and countless warriors had tried and failed to slay it. Heracles tracked it to its cave, and when his arrows bounced harmlessly off its hide, when his sword shattered against its skin, he did what seemed unthinkable. He wrestled the lion with his bare hands, his arms around its neck, squeezing until finally the great beast stopped breathing. Afterward, he skinned the lion using its own claws, the only thing sharp enough to cut its hide, and from that day forward he wore the lion's skin as a cloak, its head as a helmet, invulnerable in the very hide that had protected his enemy. The second labor sent him against the Hydra, a serpent with many heads that lived in the swamps of Lerna. This creature had venomous breath, and worse, whenever Heracles cut off one of its heads, 2 more would grow back in its place. It seemed an unwinnable battle. The more he fought, the more powerful his enemy became. But Heracles' nephew Iolaus accompanied him, and together they devised a solution. As Heracles cut off each head, Iolaus would immediately cauterize the wound with a burning torch, searing it so nothing could grow back. Finally, only the immortal head remained, which Heracles could not kill but could bury under an enormous rock, trapping it forever. He dipped his arrows in the Hydra's blood, making them poisonous, a gift that would later become a curse. The third labor required him to capture the Ceryneian hind, a sacred deer with golden antlers that belonged to Artemis. He could not harm it, could not kill it, but had to bring it back alive. For a full year, Heracles pursued the hind across Greece, never resting, until finally the exhausted animal could run no more and he caught it gently, carrying it on his shoulders back to Eurystheus. The fourth labor sent him to capture the Erymanthian boar, a massive creature terrorizing Mount Erymanthus. Heracles drove it into deep snow where it floundered, then captured it in a net. But on this journey, he accidentally caused the death of the centaur Chiron, wisest and kindest of all centaurs, who had taught many heroes. One of Heracles' poisoned arrows struck Chiron accidentally, and though the centaur was immortal, the Hydra's venom caused him such unending agony that he eventually gave up his immortality to Prometheus, choosing death over eternal suffering, a tragedy that haunted Heracles, another innocent destroyed by his curse. For his fifth labor, Heracles had to clean the Augean stables in a single day. King Augeas kept vast herds of cattle, and their stables had not been cleaned for 30 years. The filth was mountains high, and the task seemed designed to humiliate the great hero, reducing him to the work of the lowest servant. But Heracles, showing that his mind was as strong as his body, diverted 2 rivers through the stables, using the power of water to wash away in hours what would have taken months by hand. The sixth labor sent him to drive away the Stymphalian birds, man-eating creatures with bronze beaks and metallic feathers they could launch like arrows. Athena gave him bronze castanets made by Hephaestus, and the noise frightened the birds into flight, where Heracles could shoot them down with his arrows. The seventh labor required him to capture the Cretan bull, father of the Minotaur, which was rampaging across Crete. Heracles wrestled it into submission and brought it back alive to Eurystheus. For the eighth labor, he had to steal the man-eating mares of Diomedes. These horses fed on human flesh, and their master, the cruel king Diomedes, would feed them with guests who came to his palace. Heracles captured the mares and, in some versions, fed Diomedes himself to his own horses, a poetic justice for his cruelty. The ninth labor sent him to obtain the belt of Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons, fierce warrior women who lived apart from men and fought with unmatched skill. Hippolyta, impressed by Heracles, was willing to give him the belt peacefully, but Hera spread a rumor among the Amazons that Heracles intended to kidnap their queen. Battle broke out, and in the fighting, Hippolyta was killed, another innocent victim of Hera's eternal vendetta. The 10th labor required him to steal the cattle of Geryon, a monster with 3 bodies joined at the waist, who lived on an island at the edge of the world. To reach the island, Heracles had to travel to the ends of the earth, and at the Strait of Gibraltar, he set up 2 pillars, the pillars of Heracles, marking the boundary of the known world, beyond which lay only mystery. He killed Geryon and drove the cattle back across the whole of the Mediterranean to Greece, a journey that took years and was its own epic of smaller adventures. The 11th labor sent him to the garden of the Hesperides, the nymphs of the evening, to steal the golden apples that grew there. These apples granted immortality, and the tree was guarded by Ladon, a 100-headed dragon. The garden was at the world's western edge, where Atlas held up the sky. Heracles made a bargain with Atlas. He would hold the sky temporarily if Atlas would retrieve the apples, as the Hesperides were Atlas's daughters and might give them to him. Atlas agreed, grateful for even a brief respite from his eternal burden. But when Atlas returned with the apples, he was reluctant to take the sky back onto his shoulders. Heracles, thinking quickly, pretended to agree but asked Atlas to hold the sky just for a moment while he adjusted his cloak for padding. Atlas, not the brightest of titans, took the sky back, and Heracles grabbed the apples and walked away, leaving the titan to his eternal task. The 12th and final labor was the most daunting of all: descend into the underworld and bring back Cerberus, the 3-headed dog that guarded the gates of Hades' realm. No living person had ever done this and returned. Heracles made the dangerous journey down into the shadowed lands of the dead, and he spoke with Hades himself, asking permission to take Cerberus temporarily. Hades, impressed by his courage and courtesy, for even in the underworld, proper behavior mattered. Agreed, with one condition: Heracles must subdue Cerberus without using any weapons. So Heracles wrestled the monstrous dog with his bare hands, wrapping his arms around all 3 snarling heads, holding on while Cerberus's serpent tail struck him, while the dog tried to tear free. Finally, Cerberus submitted, recognizing superior strength. Heracles carried him up to the surface, showed him to the terrified Eurystheus who had hidden in a large jar when he saw the beast, then respectfully returned Cerberus to his post. The labors were complete. But the labors, though they cleansed Heracles of his guilt for his family's murder, did not end his suffering or his story. Hera's hatred continued to pursue him. After the labors, Heracles married again, this time Deianira, and for a while he knew peace. But crossing a river one day, Deianira was carried across by the centaur Nessus while Heracles swam. Nessus, inflamed with desire, tried to assault Deianira on the far bank. Heracles, enraged, shot him with one of his hydra-poisoned arrows. As Nessus lay dying, he whispered to Deianira that his blood, mixed with the hydra's venom, would act as a love potion. If ever Heracles' affections wandered, she should smear this blood on his clothing, and it would bring his love back to her. It was a lie, the dying revenge of a creature who knew the poison would kill. Deianira, innocent and trusting, collected the blood and kept it. Years later, when Heracles took a captive princess as a concubine, Deianira, fearful of losing her husband's love, remembered Nessus's words. She took a robe and smeared it with the blood, then sent it to Heracles as a gift. When Heracles put on the robe, the hydra's venom activated, and it began to burn him with unspeakable agony, adhering to his skin so he could not remove it. The poison that had made his arrows deadly was now destroying him from outside in. The pain was so terrible that even Heracles, who had endured every imaginable hardship, could not bear it. He built a funeral pyre on Mount Ida and asked his companions to light it, wanting to die by fire rather than continue in agony. Only his friend Philoctetes agreed to light the pyre, and as the flames rose, Zeus looked down from Olympus and decided that his son had suffered enough. He sent a thunderbolt that consumed Heracles' mortal parts, burning away everything that was human, and lifted his divine essence to Olympus itself. Heracles became a god at last, his labors ended, his suffering complete. Even Hera finally relented, and on Olympus, Heracles married Hebe, goddess of youth, beginning an eternal life of peace that had eluded him entirely in his mortal existence. His story became the archetypal tale of redemption through suffering, of how even the greatest strengths cannot protect us from fate, from the consequences of forces beyond our control, and yet how perseverance, courage, and the willingness to endure can transform even the most cursed life into something approaching grace. If Heracles represented the hero as strongman, the embodiment of physical power facing challenges through sheer might and endurance, then Theseus represented something more complex, the hero as king, as thinker, as founder of civilization itself. Theseus was Athens' greatest hero, and his stories were shaped to reflect Athenian values, cleverness, justice, democratic ideals, the triumph of order over chaos. Theseus was born in Treason, son of either King Aegeus of Athens or the sea god Poseidon. The dual paternity was intentional, suggesting both mortal and divine heritage. His mother was Aethra, and before Aegeus left Treason to return to Athens, he placed his sword and sandals under a heavy boulder, telling Aethra that when their son was strong enough to lift the stone and claim these tokens, he should come to Athens and reveal himself as Aegeus's heir. Theseus grew up strong and clever, and when he came of age, he lifted the boulder as easily as if it were a pebble, claimed his birthright, and set out for Athens. But rather than take the safe sea route, he chose to walk the dangerous coast road, deliberately seeking out adventure, wanting to prove himself through deeds rather than simply through birth. Along the road, he encountered a series of villains, bandits who had been terrorizing travelers for years, each with their own signature method of murder. Theseus defeated them all, and in each case, he killed them using their own methods, a kind of poetic justice that appealed to Greek sensibilities. First came Periphetes, who clubbed travelers to death with an iron club. Theseus took the club from him and beat him with it, then kept the club as his weapon. Next was Cenes, who would bend 2 pine trees down, tie a traveler between them, then release the trees, tearing the person apart. Theseus gave him the same death. At the cliffs of Megara, he found Siren, who forced travelers to wash his feet, then kicked them off the cliff to be eaten by a giant sea turtle. Theseus threw Siren to the turtle instead. He encountered Circean, who forced travelers to wrestle him to the death. None had ever won. Theseus, trained in wrestling, defeated and killed him. And finally, most horrifically, he came to the house of Procrustes, who offered hospitality to travelers, giving them a bed for the night. But Procrustes had an iron bed, and he would stretch short guests on a rack to fit the bed, or cut the legs off tall guests to make them fit. Theseus subjected him to his own bed, cutting him down to size permanently. By the time Theseus reached Athens, he was already famous, already a hero, but his greatest trial still awaited. Athens at this time was under a terrible curse. Years before, King Minos of Crete had sent his son to Athens, and the young man had been killed, either murdered by jealous athletes or killed by the Marathonian bull that Heracles had brought from Crete. In revenge, Minos had conquered Athens and imposed a horrific tribute. Every 9 years, Athens must send 7 young men and 7 young women to Crete, where they would be thrown into the labyrinth to be devoured by the Minotaur. The Minotaur was a monster, half man and half bull, the offspring of Minos's wife Pasiphae and a sacred bull. The god Poseidon had sent Minos a beautiful white bull to be sacrificed, but Minos, desiring to keep such a magnificent animal, had sacrificed a different bull instead. Poseidon, angered by this impiety, caused Persephone to develop an unnatural passion for the white bull. She commissioned the craftsman Daedalus to build a hollow wooden cow, so realistic that the bull was deceived. Persephone hid inside it, and from this bizarre union came the Minotaur, a creature so monstrous, so shameful, that Minos had Daedalus construct the labyrinth to hide it, a maze so complex that anyone who entered would never find their way out. Into this labyrinth, the Athenian youths were sent to die, and the time had come again for the tribute. Theseus, though newly recognized as the Prince of Athens, though his father begged him not to risk himself, volunteered to be one of the 7 young men, vowing that he would kill the Minotaur and end the tribute forever. The ship that carried the 14 youths to Crete sailed under black sails, mourning sails, for it was a journey to death. Theseus promised his father Aegeus that if he succeeded, he would change the sails to white on the return journey, so Aegeus could know from afar that his son lived. When they arrived in Crete, Minos brought the Athenians before his court to inspect them before sending them to their doom. And there, Minos's daughter Ariadne saw Theseus and fell instantly, helplessly in love with him. She could not bear the thought of this beautiful, brave young man being torn apart by her half-brother, the monster in the labyrinth. Ariadne went to Daedalus, the craftsman who had built the labyrinth, and asked him how someone might enter and still find their way out. Daedalus, perhaps troubled by the cruelty of Minos's tribute, perhaps pitying the girl's love, gave her a simple solution, a ball of thread. If Theseus tied one end at the entrance and unwound it as he went deeper, he could follow it back. That night, Ariadne came to Theseus and gave him the ball of thread, along with a sword to fight the Minotaur. In return, she made him promise to take her away from Crete, to marry her, to give her a new life in Athens. Theseus agreed, perhaps truly loving her, perhaps simply pragmatic about accepting help however it came. The next day, Theseus and the other Athenians were sent into the labyrinth. The entrance closed behind them, and they walked into darkness, following passages that twisted and turned, branched and doubled back, a nightmare made of stone. Behind them, Theseus left a trail of thread, their only hope of escape. Deep in the heart of the labyrinth, they heard it, a terrible bellowing, half human, half beast, echoing off the walls. And then the Minotaur appeared. Huge, powerful, with the head and shoulders of a bull on a man's muscular body, its eyes red with rage and hunger, bones of previous victims scattered around its lair. The fight was desperate. The Minotaur was strong, and the confined space of the labyrinth gave Theseus little room to maneuver. But Theseus had faced monsters before, had learned that cleverness could overcome raw power. He dodged the creature's charges, let it exhaust itself, then drove Ariadne's sword deep into the Minotaur's heart. The creature fell with a crash that shook the walls, and the curse that had hung over Athens for years died with it. Following the thread, Theseus led the Athenians back through the twisting passages to the entrance, where Ariadne was waiting. They took her and fled to their ship, cutting holes in the hulls of all the other Cretan ships in the harbor so they could not be pursued, and sailed quickly away, their mission impossibly accomplished. But the journey home was where Theseus's story takes a darker turn, revealing that heroes are not simply good or evil, that even the greatest can be cruel, can fail, can make choices that haunt them. They stopped at the island of Naxos to rest, and there, while Ariadne slept on the beach, Theseus made a decision. Some versions say he abandoned her deliberately, having used her and now having no further need of her. Other versions, more generous, say that Dionysus appeared to him and demanded Ariadne for himself, that she was fated to be the god's bride, and Theseus had no choice but to leave her. But either way, when Ariadne woke, the ship was gone, carrying away the men she loved, the men she had betrayed her father to save, and she was alone on a deserted island. Ariadne's fate, at least, turned out well. Dionysus did come to her, and he loved her truly, making her his wife and granting her immortality. But Theseus's betrayal, whether necessary or not, leaves a stain on his heroism, a reminder that even those we call heroes are complicated, capable of both nobility and cruelty. And then came the greatest tragedy, the consequence of forgetting. Theseus, in his joy at victory, in the excitement of escape, in whatever turmoil his abandonment of Ariadne caused him, forgot to change the sails from black to white. As the ship approached Athens, King Aegeus stood on a cliff watching the horizon, as he had stood every day since his son left, hoping for that glimpse of white that would mean Theseus lived. When he saw the black sails, his heart broke. Believing his son dead, his heir lost to the Minotaur, Aegeus threw himself from the cliff into the sea that would thereafter bear his name, the Aegean Sea, named for a father's grief, for a suicide born from miscommunication and forgetfulness. Theseus returned home a hero who had freed Athens from the tribute, but also a king who had indirectly killed his father, a burden he would carry for the rest of his life. He ruled Athens well, establishing many of the democratic institutions that would make the city great, but his personal life continued to be marked by tragedy. He abducted Helen of Sparta when she was still a child, intending to marry her when she came of age, though she was rescued by her brothers before that could happen. He descended to the underworld with his friend Pirithous to kidnap Persephone herself, in a mad plan that saw Pirithous trapped forever in the house of Hades while Theseus was only rescued later by Heracles. In the end, Theseus died far from home, his own people having exiled him after his chaotic personal life and poor decisions late in his reign had turned them against him. He died on the island of Skyros, and later generations would argue whether he was pushed off a cliff or simply fell. But Athens remembered him not for his failures but for his triumphs, for the young hero who had slain the Minotaur, and they claimed his bones from Skyros centuries later, building them a shrine, making him into something more than a man, a symbol of Athenian courage, cleverness, and civilization. These two heroes, Heracles and Theseus, represented different pathways through myth, different aspects of what it meant to be heroic in the Greek imagination. But there were many others, each with their own gifts and failures, and among them was one whose story would weave together love and duty, skill and hubris, to create a tragedy that speaks across millennia about the cost of ambition and the nature of true artistry. This was Daedalus, the master craftsman, whose name meant cunning worker. Daedalus was Athenian by birth, renowned throughout Greece for his inventions and his ability to create things so lifelike they seemed ready to move and breathe. He had a nephew, Talos, who studied under him and showed even greater promise, inventing the saw and the compass while still a boy. Daedalus, jealous of being surpassed, pushed his nephew off the Acropolis to his death, then fled Athens to escape punishment. He came to Crete, where King Minos welcomed him and put his talents to use. Daedalus built the hollow cow that allowed Persephone to mate with the bull. When the Minotaur was born from that union, Daedalus built the labyrinth to contain it. He became Minos's prisoner as much as his craftsman, for Minos would not allow him to leave, knowing that Daedalus possessed too many secrets of Crete's defenses and wonders. When Theseus escaped the labyrinth using Daedalus's own secret, Minos was furious. He imprisoned Daedalus and his young son Icarus in a tower, vowing they would never leave Crete. But Daedalus, whose mind was his greatest tool, observed the birds flying past the tower window and conceived a plan. He gathered feathers that fell or that he could catch, wax from the candles in the tower, and wood from the furniture. And slowly, secretly, he constructed wings, not just for himself but for Icarus as well. When the wings were complete, Daedalus attached them to their shoulders and prepared for their escape. He warned Icarus carefully, "Fly a middle course. Not too low, or the sea spray will soak the feathers and make them heavy. Not too high, or the sun will melt the wax and the wings will fall apart. Stay with me, follow my path, and we will reach safety." They launched themselves from the tower window at dawn, when the guards were changing and the light was still dim. The wings caught the air, held them aloft, and they flew, truly flew, out over the walls of the palace, over the harbor, heading north across the Aegean toward freedom. Daedalus felt the exhilaration mixed with terror, his invention working, bearing them both toward safety. Behind him, he could hear Icarus laughing with pure joy, a sound he had not heard from his son in all their months of imprisonment. But there is something in youth that cannot resist testing boundaries, that hears a warning and wonders what would happen if it were ignored. Icarus felt the wind beneath the wings, felt himself lifted higher, and the sensation was glorious beyond anything he had imagined. He began to climb, soaring upward, and the world below became small, the islands like scattered jewels, the sea an endless field of blue. Higher and higher he flew, intoxicated by the freedom, by the godlike sensation of flight. Daedalus, looking back, saw his son ascending too high and called out desperately, "Icarus! Come down. Remember what I told you." But the wind carried his words away, or perhaps Icarus simply could not hear over the roar of air past his ears, the pounding of his own heart. He climbed toward the sun, and the sun, indifferent, blazed down upon him. The wax began to soften. The feathers loosened. Icarus felt the wings beginning to fail but could not understand what was happening until suddenly the feathers were tearing away, scattering like snow, and the wax was running down his arms in hot streams. For one terrible moment he hung suspended with nothing holding him, his arms still moving in the motion of flight but finding no purchase on the air. Then he fell. Daedalus heard his son scream his name and turned to see Icarus plummeting, the ruined wings trailing behind him, falling faster and faster until he struck the sea with a distant splash. Daedalus flew down desperately, circling the spot where his son had fallen, but there was nothing, only feathers floating on the surface, only the indifferent waves, only the sea that would bear Icarus's name thereafter, the Icarian Sea, where a boy's ambition and a father's ingenuity met their limit. Daedalus retrieved his son's body and buried it on a nearby island. He completed his flight to Sicily, but he never built wings again, never again tried to give mortals the power of the gods. He had learned what all great craftsmen eventually learn, that there are some boundaries that should not be crossed, some powers that mortals cannot safely wield, and that every triumph of art and engineering carries within it the potential for tragedy. The story of Daedalus and Icarus became a meditation on the relationship between father and son, on the tension between caution born of experience and the recklessness of youth, on the price of hubris, but also on the cost of innovation itself. For Daedalus did escape, his invention did work, but at a price too terrible to bear. It asks us, what good is success if it destroys what we love? What is the value of genius if it leads our children to ruin? Yet another layer of meaning emerged in later interpretations. Icarus became a symbol not of foolishness but of aspiration, of the human desire to transcend our limitations even if it destroys us. He flew too close to the sun, yes, but he flew. For those moments before the fall, he knew something that perhaps justified the risk, the sensation of godhood, of breaking free from all constraints, of reaching toward the divine even if he could not maintain such heights. His fall became tragic not because he was foolish, but because he dared greatly in the world. The physical reality of wax and feathers and heat could not sustain his dream. The Greeks understood that every gift carried a curse, every strength a weakness, every triumph the seeds of future tragedy. This wisdom runs through all their myths, but perhaps nowhere more completely than in the story of the Trojan War, that great conflict that drew together nearly every major hero of the age and ended in fire and blood and the destruction of one of the ancient world's most magnificent cities. The war began, as so many disasters do, at a wedding, but a wedding to which not everyone was invited. Peleus, a mortal hero, was marrying Thetis, a sea nymph, and all the gods came to celebrate, for this was a rare union of mortal and divine. All the gods except one. Eris, goddess of discord and strife, was not invited, for who wants discord at their wedding feast? But Eris, insulted, came anyway, arriving uninvited with a gift, a golden apple inscribed with the words, "To the fairest." She rolled this apple into the midst of the celebration and disappeared, and immediately 3 goddesses reached for it simultaneously, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. Each believed herself the fairest, and each demanded the apple. The other gods, wisely, refused to judge between them, for how do you choose among the Queen of Heaven, the goddess of wisdom, and the embodiment of beauty itself without making eternal enemies? Zeus, pressed to make the choice, also declined, but he suggested a judge. Paris, a prince of Troy who was living as a shepherd on Mount Ida, having been exposed as an infant due to a prophecy that he would bring about Troy's destruction. Paris had survived and grown into a young man famed for his fairness in judgment and his remarkable beauty. Hermes brought the 3 goddesses to Paris, along with the golden apple, and each goddess offered him a bribe for his favor. Hera promised him power; she would make him lord of all Asia, ruler of vast territories. Athena offered him glory in war; she would make him the greatest warrior who ever lived, victorious in every battle, remembered forever for his martial prowess. And Aphrodite, smiling, offered him love, specifically, the love of Helen of Sparta, the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris, who was young and perhaps foolish, who valued beauty above power or glory, chose Aphrodite. He gave her the golden apple, and in that moment, he sealed not only his own fate but the fate of his entire city, his family, everyone he knew or would ever know. For Helen was already married to Menelaus, king of Sparta, and her abduction would set in motion events that could not be stopped. Paris traveled to Sparta as a guest, and there he met Helen. The ancient sources debate whether Aphrodite made Helen fall in love with Paris or whether she simply enabled a love that would have happened anyway, but the result was the same. Helen left her husband, her daughter, her home, and sailed away with Paris to Troy. Some versions say she went willingly, seized by divine passion. Others suggest Paris kidnapped her. But either way, the result was the same. The most beautiful woman in the world was gone, taken to Troy, and an insult had been given that could not be ignored. When Helen's many former suitors, for she had been courted by every prince in Greece before choosing Menelaus, learned what had happened, they remembered an oath they had sworn years before. Odysseus, cleverest of mortals, had suggested when Helen was choosing her husband that all the suitors swear to defend her marriage, to come to the aid of whoever she chose if anyone ever tried to take her away. They had agreed, never thinking the oath would be called upon. Now Menelaus invoked it, and all across Greece, armies began to gather. The forces assembled at Aulis, hundreds of ships, thousands of men, the greatest collection of heroes Greece had ever seen. There was Agamemnon, Menelaus's brother and the most powerful king in Greece, who would lead the expedition. There was Achilles, son of Peleus and Thetis, the greatest warrior alive, young and beautiful and deadly, accompanied by his beloved companion Patroclus. There was Ajax the Greater, massive and strong, a warrior second only to Achilles in prowess. There was Diomedes, fierce and favored by Athena. There was Odysseus, king of Ithaca, whose cunning would prove as valuable as any sword. But the fleet could not sail. Day after day they waited at Aulis, and day after day there was no wind, or the wind blew from the wrong direction, and the ships sat idle while the men grew restless and supplies dwindled. Finally, the seer Calchas revealed the truth. Artemis was angry with Agamemnon for killing one of her sacred deer and boasting he was a better hunter than the goddess. She would not let the winds blow until Agamemnon appeased her, and the price was terrible. He must sacrifice his own daughter, Iphigenia. Agamemnon faced an impossible choice: abandon the expedition, fail his brother, lose his honor and authority among the Greeks, or kill his own child to satisfy divine anger. In the end, he chose the expedition. He sent word to his wife Clytemnestra that Iphigenia should come to Aulis, claiming falsely that she was to marry Achilles. When the girl arrived, joyful at her supposed coming wedding, she was led to the altar instead. Different versions tell what happened next differently. In some, Iphigenia was sacrificed, her throat cut, her blood spilling on the altar while her mother's screams echoed across the camp. In others, Artemis, satisfied by Agamemnon's willingness to go through with it, substituted a deer at the last moment and spirited Iphigenia away to serve as her priestess in distant lands. But either way, Clytemnestra saw her daughter led to death by her own father, and something in her heart hardened like cooling metal, forging a hatred that would wait years but would not be denied forever. The winds came. The fleet sailed across the Aegean, 1,000 ships carrying the doom of Troy, and they beached on the shores of the Troad, that fertile land surrounding Troy's high walls. What followed was a war that would last 10 years, dragging on through seasons and years, becoming something that none of the participants could have imagined when they set out, a grinding, bitter conflict that consumed nearly everyone it touched. The war's details are too numerous to recount in full. It filled the Iliad, Homer's great epic, and still that poem covers only a few weeks in the 10th year of the conflict. But certain moments stand out, crystallizing what the war meant, what it revealed about gods and men, glory and suffering. There was the rage of Achilles, greatest of the Greek warriors, who withdrew from battle when Agamemnon insulted him by taking his war prize, a captive woman named Briseis. Achilles sulked in his tent while his fellow Greeks died, his pride wounded, his honor demanding satisfaction. The Trojans, freed from the threat of Achilles, pressed their advantage, driving the Greeks back almost to their ships, threatening to burn the fleet and trap the invaders far from home. Finally, Patroclus, Achilles' dearest friend, his companion, his other self, loved with an intensity that transcended easy categories, begged Achilles to either return to battle himself or let Patroclus fight in his place. Achilles agreed to the latter, giving Patroclus his own armor, and Patroclus led the Myrmidons, Achilles' warriors, into battle. The Trojans, seeing what they thought was Achilles himself entering the fight, fell back in terror. But Patroclus, emboldened by success, pushed too far. He chased the Trojans to the very walls of Troy, and there he encountered Hector, eldest son of King Priam, Troy's greatest defender, a man fighting not for glory but for his city, his wife, his infant son. Apollo, favoring the Trojans, disoriented Patroclus, and Hector struck him down, driving his spear through the borrowed armor, killing Achilles' beloved. When Achilles learned of Patroclus' death, his grief was terrible beyond words. He screamed so loudly that his mother Thetis heard him from the depths of the sea and came to comfort him. But there was no comfort for such loss. Achilles' rage, which had been directed at Agamemnon, now turned toward the Trojans, toward Hector specifically, with an intensity that was almost inhuman. He would have revenge or die trying. Thetis, knowing her son was fated to die if he returned to battle but unable to dissuade him, at least ensured he would fight in the finest armor ever made. She went to Hephaestus, who owed her a debt, and the smith god crafted armor of divine quality, a shield decorated with scenes of the entire cosmos, the cities of men at peace and at war, the earth and sea and sky, all of human life captured in imperishable bronze and gold. Wearing this armor, Achilles returned to the battlefield like a force of nature, like death itself. He cut through the Trojan ranks, driving them back, killing without mercy, and the river's commander ran red with blood until the river god himself rose up to protest this desecration. Achilles fought even the river, and only divine intervention prevented him from drowning in its angry waters. Finally, inevitably, Achilles met Hector before the walls of Troy. 3 times Achilles chased Hector around the city walls while both armies watched, and on the 3rd circuit, Hector, encouraged by what he thought was his brother Deiphobus coming to aid him but was actually Athena in disguise, turned to face his pursuer. They fought, and Achilles, the greater warrior, drove his spear into the only unprotected spot in Hector's armor, the space at the collarbone. As Hector lay dying, he begged Achilles to return his body to his family for proper burial. Achilles refused with shocking cruelty, saying that he wished he could eat Hector's flesh raw, that dogs and birds would devour him unburied. He tied Hector's corpse to his chariot and dragged it around the walls of Troy while Hector's family watched from above, his father Priam, his mother Hecuba, his wife Andromache holding their baby son, all of them screaming in anguish at the desecration. For days, Achilles continued to drag Hector's body around Patroclus's tomb, unable to let his rage go, unable to stop even though Patroclus was beyond help. It was an act that horrified even the gods, for the Greeks believed that proper burial was essential, that denying it was one of the worst cruelties possible. Finally, Zeus commanded Achilles to accept ransom for the body. That night, King Priam came secretly to Achilles' tent, an old man venturing into the camp of his enemies to beg for his son's corpse. He knelt before Achilles and kissed his hands, the hands that had killed his son, and begged him to remember his own father, to imagine how Peleus would feel if Achilles died and his body was denied burial. It is one of the most powerful scenes in all of literature, this moment when enemy meets enemy not as warriors but as fathers and sons, and Achilles, seeing his own father in Priam's aged face, finally wept. He returned Hector's body, gave Priam 12 days of truce for the funeral, and for a moment, humanity broke through the brutality of war. But it was only a moment. The Iliad ends with Hector's funeral, but the war continued, and Achilles' fate, prophesied since birth, waited for him. Shortly after, Paris, guided by Apollo, shot Achilles with an arrow that struck his heel, the one part of his body that was vulnerable. For when Achilles was a baby, Thetis had dipped him in the river Styx to make him invulnerable, but she had held him by the heel, and that spot remained mortal. The greatest warrior of the age died from what seemed like a minor wound, killed not in glorious single combat but by an arrow from Troy's least martial prince, a reminder that fate makes fools of us all. The Greeks despaired, but the war was not over. Odysseus conceived a plan so audacious, so clever, that it has become synonymous with deception itself. The Greeks would appear to give up, to sail away, leaving behind a massive wooden horse as an offering to the gods for a safe journey home. But hidden inside the horse would be their best warriors, waiting for night and Troy's complacent celebration of the war's end. The plan worked. The Trojans, despite warnings from the prophet Cassandra and the priest Laocoon, dragged the horse into their city. That night, the warriors emerged, opened the gates, and the Greek army, which had only pretended to sail away, came pouring back. Troy burned. 10 years of war ended in a single night of slaughter. King Priam was killed at the altar of Zeus, seeking sanctuary that was not granted. Hector's infant son Astyanax was thrown from the walls, killed so he could not grow up to avenge his father. Hector's wife Andromache was taken as a slave. Hecuba, queen of Troy, watched her entire family destroyed and was transformed, the myths say, into a dog, so complete was her degradation and grief. Cassandra, who had foreseen all of this but been cursed never to be believed, was raped in Athena's temple by Ajax the Lesser and taken as Agamemnon's concubine. Helen, the cause of it all, was claimed again by Menelaus, who intended to kill her but found that when he saw her face again, his anger melted, and he took her back to Sparta, where they would live out their days in a peace that must have been haunted by the ghosts of all who died for her sake. The Greeks sailed for home, but the gods, disgusted by the brutality of the war's end, by the sacrilege committed in their temples during the sack, sent storms that scattered the fleet. Some ships were destroyed. Others were blown far off course, so that journeys that should have taken weeks took years. And Odysseus, whose cleverness had won the war, would take 10 years to reach home, his journey becoming another epic, the Odyssey, a story of longing and persistence, of trying to return to a life that the war had made impossible to fully reclaim. Agamemnon reached home first among the major heroes, but no triumph waited for him. Clytemnestra had not forgotten or forgiven Iphigenia's death. She had taken a lover, Aegisthus, and together they had planned their revenge. They welcomed Agamemnon home with feasts and celebration, and when he went to bathe, relaxing after the long voyage, they struck. Clytemnestra herself killed him, some say with an axe, some say with a sword, trapping him first in a net or a robe so he could not defend himself. She killed Cassandra too, the Trojan prophet who had come as Agamemnon's concubine, and she felt no remorse, only the satisfaction of long-delayed justice. But violence begets violence. Agamemnon and Clytemnestra's son Orestes, raised away from home, returned as a young man and, commanded by Apollo himself, killed his mother and her lover to avenge his father. This matricide, even though divinely commanded, was considered so terrible that the Furies, those ancient spirits of vengeance born when Kronos wounded Arenas, pursued Orestes relentlessly, driving him mad with guilt. Finally, Athena intervened, establishing a court in Athens to try Orestes, and when the vote was tied, she cast the deciding vote for acquittal, establishing the principle that sometimes cycles of revenge must be broken, that justice requires mercy as well as retribution. The story of the house of Atreus, Agamemnon's family, became a meditation on inherited guilt, on how violence passes from generation to generation, how the sins of fathers fall upon children, and how difficult it is to break free from patterns established long before we were born. It asked whether we are responsible for crimes we are almost compelled to commit, whether divine command excuses human action, where justice ends and vengeance begins. These are not comfortable questions. The Greeks did not shy away from them. Their myths are filled with ambiguity, with situations where every choice leads to suffering, where the gods themselves disagree about what is right, where the heroes we admire commit acts we deplore. This moral complexity, this refusal to simplify human experience, is part of what makes Greek mythology endure. It does not offer easy answers because life does not offer easy answers. Let us leave these battle-scarred heroes and turn to gentler myths, to stories that speak of the natural world and our place within it. The Greeks saw divinity everywhere, in trees and streams, in mountains and meadows, in the very air they breathed. Their landscape was alive with spirits, and many of their myths explain how particular features of the natural world came to be, why certain flowers bloom in certain seasons, why some places feel sacred and others cursed. Consider the story of Baucis and Philemon, which we touched upon earlier, but also the countless other tales of metamorphosis into plants and natural features. Hyacinthus became a flower. Daphne became a laurel tree. Narcissus became the flower that bears his name. Cypress trees were said to have grown from a youth named Cyparissus who grieved so deeply for his accidentally killed pet deer that the gods transformed him into a tree associated with mourning. These stories suggest a worldview in which the boundary between human and nature was permeable, in which transformation into plant or animal or geographical feature was not an ending but a continuation, a different form of existence. The nymphs embodied this close relationship between divine and natural. They were everywhere, oreads in the mountains, naiads in freshwater streams and springs, nereids in the sea, dryads in trees, especially oaks. They were beautiful, immortal or nearly so, and they represented the life force of the natural features they inhabited. When a tree died, its dryad died with it. When a stream ran dry, its naiad faded. The health of nature and the health of these spirits were interconnected, inseparable. Many heroes encountered nymphs in their wanderings, sometimes with joyful results, sometimes with tragic ones. The satyr Marsyas found a flute that Athena had thrown away. She had invented it but discarded it when she saw how playing it distorted her face. Marsyas picked up the flute and learned to play it beautifully, and he became so confident in his skill that he challenged Apollo to a musical contest, his flute against Apollo's lyre. The Muses judged the contest, and they declared it a tie until Apollo added singing to his lyre playing, something Marsyas could not do while playing the flute. Apollo won, and his punishment for Marsyas' presumption was brutal. He flayed the satyr alive, hanging his skin in a cave as a warning against challenging the gods. The nymphs and woodland spirits wept so many tears for Marsyas that their weeping formed a river, another instance of grief becoming landscape, emotion literally reshaping geography. Pan, god of shepherds and flocks, wild places and panic, was himself half goat, with a human torso but the legs, horns, and ears of a goat. He lived in Arcadia, the mountainous heart of the Peloponnese, and he spent his days playing his pipes, shepherding his flocks, and pursuing nymphs who generally fled from his advances. He invented the Pan pipes after falling in love with the nymph Syrinx, who, fleeing his pursuit, begged the river gods to transform her. They changed her into reeds, and Pan, finding only reeds where Syrinx had stood, cut them and fashioned them into the pipes that would forever bear her name, his music a memorial to lost love. Pan's appearance alarmed those who encountered him unexpectedly in the wilderness, and the word panic derives from his name, that sudden, overwhelming fear that grips travelers in lonely places, the sense that something wild and other is watching from the shadows. But he was not malevolent, merely wild, representing nature's indifference to human concerns, the way the natural world operates according to its own laws regardless of our wishes or plans. These stories of nature spirits remind us that the Greeks did not see themselves as separate from or above nature, but as part of it, subject to its rhythms and requirements. They understood that civilization was a thin layer over wildness, that beyond the city walls or even within them in gardens and groves, older powers held sway, powers that predated the Olympians, that would outlast any particular human culture, that represented forces far more fundamental than any temporary arrangements of law or custom. The natural world, then, was not merely backdrop to human drama but participant, witness, and sometimes arbiter. The Greeks lived close enough to the earth to know that human life depended entirely on forces beyond mortal control, the rains that watered crops, the seasons that turned reliably or failed catastrophically, the wilderness that could provide sustenance or death with equal indifference. Their myths acknowledge this dependence, this fundamental humility that urbanized life sometimes lets us forget. And now, as our journey through these ancient stories moves toward its conclusion, let us consider what might be the most important myth of all for understanding the Greek relationship with the divine, the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, a story about love and loss, about the limits of human will, about what we can and cannot change through art, through devotion, through sheer refusal to accept what fate has decreed. Orpheus was the son of the muse Calliope, and he inherited from his mother the gift of music beyond anything mortals had achieved before or since. When Orpheus played his lyre and sang, trees would uproot themselves to move closer, rivers would pause in their courses to listen, wild animals would lie down peacefully together, stones themselves would weep. His music had power not through magic but through its pure beauty, through its ability to touch something essential in all beings, to remind them of harmonies deeper than conflict, older than suffering. Orpheus fell in love with Eurydice, a dryad of surpassing beauty and gentleness, and she loved him in return. Their wedding was celebrated with joy, though the omens were not good, the torches sputtered and smoked instead of burning clear and bright. Still, they began their married life with hope, and for a brief while, they knew happiness. But one day, walking in a meadow, Eurydice was pursued by Aristeus, a minor god who desired her. Fleeing his unwanted attentions, she did not watch her steps carefully enough. She trod upon a serpent hidden in the grass, and it bit her ankle. The venom spread quickly. By the time Orpheus reached her, she was already dying. She spoke his name once, her hand reaching for his face, and then she was gone, her spirit descending to the underworld, her body cooling in the summer grass, and Orpheus's world ended. His grief was absolute. He could not eat, could not sleep, could only play his lyre, and the songs he played were so mournful that even the gods wept to hear them. All of nature mourned with him, birds fell silent, Rivers ran more slowly, flowers closed their petals. For days he did nothing but grieve, but then, slowly, a resolution formed in his heart. He would do what no living mortal had successfully done. He would descend into the underworld and bring Eurydice back. Others had visited the land of the dead and returned. Heracles, Odysseus, a few others, but none had gone to reclaim a soul already claimed, to ask death itself for mercy. Still, Orpheus had one advantage they lacked, his music. And so, taking only his lyre, he found the entrance to the underworld, a cave that led down into darkness, and he began his descent. The journey down was terrible, past the river Styx where Charon the ferryman poles his craft endlessly, past Cerberus the three-headed guardian, past the fields of asphodel where ordinary souls wandered in gray twilight, past the place where the wicked suffered eternal punishments. Everywhere Orpheus walked, he played his lyre, and the music transformed that realm of shadow and sorrow. Charon, who accepted only the dead, ferried Orpheus across without payment. Cerberus, who let none pass, lay down his 3 heads and closed his eyes, listening. Even the tormented paused in their sufferings. Tantalus stopped reaching for water that receded from his lips. Sisyphus's boulder rolled back down the hill and he sat upon it to listen. Ixion's will ceased its spinning. Finally, Orpheus came before the thrones of Hades and Persephone, the king and queen of the underworld, and he played for them. He sang of his love for Eurydice, of the joy they had known, of the cruel brevity of their happiness. He sang of loss, of the hole her absence left in the world, of how even birdsong sounded like mourning now. He sang not to impress them with clever arguments but simply to make them feel what he felt, to share his grief so completely that they would understand it as their own. And his music reached even those divine hearts that had heard countless pleas from countless bereaved mortals. Persephone, who knew something of being torn from the world above, who spent half her life in darkness, wept. Even Hades, stern and unyielding, felt his eyes grow damp. The Furies, those spirits of vengeance, cried for the first time since their birth from Arenas' blood. Hades spoke, his voice echoing through his vast halls. Orpheus, your music has moved us. We will grant what no one else has received. Eurydice may follow you back to the living world. Orpheus's heart surged with joy, with triumph, with a relief so profound he nearly collapsed. But Hades held up one hand, and the joy froze in Orpheus's chest, for he knew conditions were coming, and conditions in myths rarely work in the mortal's favor. She will follow behind you as you ascend, Hades said. But you must not look back at her. Not until you have both reached the upper world, until sunlight touches your face. If you look back before then, she will be lost to you forever, and she will return here never to leave again. Do you accept these terms? What choice did Orpheus have? He agreed, though already the doubt was planting itself like a seed in his mind. He turned and began the long climb back through the darkness, and behind him, though he could not see her, Eurydice followed, her shade given substance enough to walk, to climb, to return to life if only he could maintain his faith for the duration of the journey. At first, Orpheus walked confidently, his lyre in his hands, hope lighting his path better than any torch. But as the journey wore on, as the climb grew steeper and his legs grew tired, doubt began to whisper. He heard no footsteps behind him, her shade made no sound. He heard no breathing, no rustle of clothing. Was she really there? Had Hades tricked him? Or had she fallen behind, unable to keep pace, and was even now being pulled back into the depths? The silence behind him became unbearable. The doubt grew with every step until it was larger than his certainty, louder than memory. He told himself to trust, to have faith, to remember Hades' promise. But the doubt had found fertile ground in his grief-exhausted mind, and it grew like poisonous vines, strangling his confidence. Finally, he saw ahead of him a dim light, the entrance, the boundary between death and life, the place where the upper world waited. Just a few more steps and they would be safe, would be together, would have defied death itself. But the doubt overwhelmed him. He had to know, had to be certain. He convinced himself that if she was not there, it was better to find out now, here, rather than emerging alone into a world that expected her return. It was a rationalization, a failure of nerve disguised as prudence. Just before the threshold, Orpheus turned around. And there she was. Eurydice stood just behind him, her face pale but beautiful, her eyes meeting his with such love, such trust, such joy at their almost accomplished miracle. For one perfect moment, they saw each other, and Orpheus realized his terrible mistake. Eurydice's expression changed from joy to understanding to an infinite sadness. She did not reproach him, did not cry out in anger. She simply said, so softly, farewell, and the shadows took her. She faded like morning mist under sunlight, like a dream upon waking, and Orpheus was left reaching toward empty air, his fingers grasping nothing. He tried to follow her back down, but Charon would not ferry him again. The living were allowed into the underworld only once, and he had used his passage. The entrance closed to him. He had been given what no one else had received, and he had failed at the last possible moment, not because of external interference but because of his own doubt, his own inability to trust in what he could not see. Orpheus emerged into the upper world alone, and he never recovered. He wandered, playing music that was now unbearably sad, refusing the love of others, faithful to Eurydice beyond life and death. Eventually, he was torn apart by Maenads, frenzied female followers of Dionysus who were insulted by his continued devotion to his lost wife, by his rejection of their advances. His head and lyre, thrown into a river, floated all the way to the sea, still singing, still making music even in death, until finally they came to rest on the island of Lesbos, where his lyre was placed among the stars. Some say that when Orpheus died, his shade descended once more to the underworld, and there he found Eurydice again, and they walked together through the fields of asphodel for eternity, and now he could look at her all he wished, for there was nowhere left to go, nothing left to lose, only endless twilight and companionship. It is a comfort to imagine, though the Greek sources are ambiguous about whether this reunion occurred. The story of Orpheus and Eurydice has haunted Western imagination for millennia because it captures something essential about love and loss, about the nature of faith and doubt. Orpheus had the power to move stones and gods, yet he could not control his own fear. He was given an impossible gift with an impossible condition, and the condition broke him not through its difficulty but through its simplicity. All he had to do was trust, and trust was the one thing his grief had made impossible. It asks us, would we do better? When everything depends on not looking, on believing in what we cannot verify, on trusting in promises from powers we barely understand, can we sustain that faith? Or is doubt inherent in consciousness itself, the price we pay for being creatures who think and question rather than simply accept? The myth offers no answer, only the eternal image of Orpheus turning, reaching, losing everything at the moment it seemed won. And here, as our wandering through these ancient stories draws toward its close, we might pause and consider what all these myths together suggest about the Greek understanding of existence. They did not promise that life was fair, that virtue would be rewarded, that suffering had meaning beyond what we give it. The gods were powerful but not just. Heroes were mighty but not invincible. Love could transform but also destroy. Every triumph contained the seeds of future tragedy. Fate was inescapable, yet choice still mattered, perhaps not in changing outcomes but in determining how we faced those outcomes, with courage or cowardice, with grace or bitterness. The Greeks looked at the world and saw beauty alongside cruelty, order alongside chaos, reason alongside madness, and they created myths that honored all of it, that did not flinch from complexity or contradiction. Their gods were not moral exemplars but embodiments of forces. desire, wisdom, rage, craft, love, death, that shape existence whether we approve of them or not. Their heroes showed that extraordinary ability did not guarantee happiness, that divine parentage could be curse as much as blessing, that the qualities that made someone great, strength, pride, passion, cunning, were inseparable from the qualities that destroyed them. These myths were not escapism but the opposite. An unflinching engagement with reality, with the fundamental questions of human existence dressed in the garments of story so they could be contemplated, discussed, passed down through generations. They were the Greek way of asking, why do we suffer? Why do we die? Why does love hurt us? Why are we never satisfied? Why can't we escape our families, our histories, our own natures? What do we owe to each other? To the gods? To ourselves? The mystery religions that grew up around certain myths. The Eleusinian mysteries, the Orphic mysteries, the cult of Dionysus, promised initiates a different understanding, a hidden knowledge that would transform their relationship with mortality and meaning. We cannot know exactly what these mysteries taught, for the initiates kept their oaths of silence unto death, and the secrets died with them. But we know they involved ritual reenactments of divine myths, particularly myths of death and rebirth. Demeter and Persephone, Dionysus torn apart and restored, Orpheus's journey to the underworld. Perhaps what these mysteries offered was not intellectual knowledge but experiential understanding, a way of living through the myth in ritual so that its truths became embodied rather than merely believed. Perhaps they taught that death is not ending but transformation, that what seems lost may return in different form, that the cycles we observe in nature, seed becoming plant becoming seed, apply also to human existence in ways we cannot fully grasp while living. Dionysus himself, god of wine, theater, ecstasy, and madness, embodied this transgression of boundaries. He was born twice, once from his mother Semele, who was incinerated when she convinced Zeus to reveal his true form, and then sewn into Zeus's thigh to complete his gestation, making him literally twice born. He traveled to the underworld and returned. He was torn apart by Titans and restored. His worship involved ecstatic dancing, the dissolution of normal social boundaries, the temporary madness that wine and ritual could induce, a controlled chaos that reminded participants that order was not everything, that sometimes we need to let go of control, of reason, of the rigid structures that define civilized life. The theater itself, which was one of ancient Greece's great gifts to civilization, grew from religious festivals honoring Dionysus. The tragedies performed there were ritual explorations of myth, communal contemplations of suffering and fate, catharsis through witnessed pain. When Athenians gathered in the theater of Dionysus to watch Oedipus discover his terrible crimes, or Medea murder her children, or Agamemnon die in his bath, they were not seeking entertainment in our modern sense but something deeper. A collective reckoning with the darkness that exists in every human heart, with the ways that even the best intentions can lead to horror, with the reality that knowledge can destroy and ignorance can doom. These myths, then, were not merely stories but technologies of meaning-making, ways of processing the inexplicable, of finding pattern in chaos, of bearing the unbearable by naming it, giving it shape, acknowledging it as part of the fabric of existence rather than an aberration to be denied. And now, dear friend, as the night deepens and our journey approaches its end, let us return to where we began, to the fundamental mystery of story itself, to why these particular stories have survived when so much else from the ancient world has crumbled into dust and silence. The myths endure because they are true, though not in the way a history or a science is true. They are true in the way that dreams are true, in the way that poetry is true. They capture something essential about subjective experience, about what it feels like to be human, to be conscious, to be alive in a world we did not make and cannot fully understand. When we read about Prometheus stealing fire, we recognize our own defiance, our own willingness to suffer for what we believe will help others. When we read about Narcissus staring into the pool, we recognize our own self-absorption, our modern obsession with image and appearance. When we read about Orpheus looking back, we recognize our own doubt, our inability to trust in what we cannot verify, our tendency to destroy through anxiety what patience might have preserved. The myths give form to formless things, to emotions too complex for simple description, to fears too primal for rational discourse, to hopes too audacious to state plainly. They let us contemplate obliquely what we cannot confront directly. They create a space where we can acknowledge that we are neither wholly rational nor wholly good, that we contain multitudes and contradictions, that the same heart that loves can hate, that the same mind that builds can destroy. And perhaps most importantly, in our current age of individualism and isolation, these myths remind us that we are part of something larger. Part of a human conversation that has been ongoing for thousands of years, part of a community of meaning that stretches across centuries and continents. When we tell these stories, we join our voices to an ancient chorus, and we discover that our most personal struggles, our griefs, our loves, our fears, our hopes, have been felt and named and contemplated by countless others before us. The gods of Olympus have long since departed, if they were ever there in the literal sense that the ancient Greeks sometimes believed and sometimes doubted. The temples are ruins, elegant skeletons of marble standing in the Greek sunlight, homes now only for lizards and tourists and the occasional feral cat. The oracles are silent. The sacrifices are no longer made. The mystery religions have lost their secrets. Yet something persists. These stories, these patterns, these images that continue to arise in our art, our literature, our dreams. We still speak of Herculean efforts, of Achilles' heels, of Pandora's boxes, of someone being a narcissist, of Odyssean journeys. We still understand immediately what it means to say someone has a Midas touch or that a task is Sisyphean. The myths have become part of our language, our conceptual furniture, ways of expressing truths that resist more direct statement. And on nights like this, when we let ourselves drift back through time, when we let these old stories wash over us like waves, like gentle tides pulling us towards sleep, we discover that they still work, still soothe, still teach. They remind us that we are neither the first nor the last to struggle with being human, with wanting what we cannot have, with loving what we will lose, with trying to make meaning in a cosmos that offers us no guarantees. The ancient Greeks lived closer to death than we generally do. Infant mortality was high, wars were constant, medicine was primitive, life expectancy was perhaps 35 years on average. They knew viscerally what we often try to forget, that we are mortal, that everyone we love will die or leave us or we will leave them, that all things pass, that even the gods, perhaps, are not eternal. And yet they celebrated life fiercely, created beauty relentlessly, told stories that insisted on meaning even in the face of meaninglessness. Their myths acknowledge darkness without being overcome by it. They admit suffering without glorifying it. They face the terrible truths, that love ends, that strength fails, that wisdom cannot prevent disaster, that fate is inexorable. And they respond not with despair but with art, with storytelling, with the insistence that even if we cannot control our destinies, we can at least name them, shape them into narrative, pass them on to those who come after. So as we prepare to part, as you feel sleep approaching or simply the need to return to the present day with its own demands and dramas, carry with you if you wish this small offering from the ancient world. The understanding that you are part of an old story, that your struggles are not unprecedented, that others have walked this path before you and left signs and markers in the form of myths that say, we too suffered. We too loved. We too wondered what it all meant. We too feared death and cherished beauty. You are not alone. The myths were the Greeks' gift to us, their way of reaching across the abyss of time to touch our hands and whisper, we were here. We were human like you. These are the stories we told ourselves. Perhaps they will help you tell your own. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is everything. To know that we are part of something larger than our individual lives, part of a human project that has been ongoing for so long that we cannot see its beginning and will not see its end, part of the great conversation about what it means to exist, to love, to suffer, to create, to die, to be remembered or forgotten, to matter or not matter in a universe whose scale makes all our concerns seem infinitesimally small, yet whose gift of consciousness makes those concerns feel infinitely important. The stars that looked down on ancient Greece still shine above us tonight, the same stars that the Greeks organized into constellations and populated with their heroes, Orion the hunter, Andromeda the rescued princess, Cassiopeia the vain queen, Perseus with his sword, Heracles with his club, the great bear that was once the nymph Callisto. The myths have been written into the heavens themselves, permanent as anything in this impermanent world, and they will shine on long after we too have become stories, memories, myths ourselves to those who come after. So rest now, if you will. Let these ancient voices sing you towards sleep. Let the myths do their work. Not teaching lessons so much as keeping company, not providing answers so much as affirming questions, not solving the mystery of existence but honoring it, celebrating it, acknowledging that the mystery is worthy of story, of art, of endless contemplation across millennia. The Greeks are gone, but they have left us their dreams, and dreams, as we know, are immortal. They slip across the border between sleep and waking, between past and present, between the living and the dead, and they whisper truths that daylight makes us forget. Tonight, we have let them whisper, and perhaps some of what they said will stay with you, will color your own dreams, will remind you when you wake that you are part of something ancient, something beautiful, something that will continue long after your own brief light has joined the countless others that shine and fade and shine again in the great turning wheel of time. Sleep well, dear friend. The myths will keep watch. They have done so for thousands of years, and they will do so for thousands more. You are safe in their embrace, held by stories that have outlasted empires, that have survived the fall of civilizations, that have proven stronger than bronze or stone or any mortal thing. And when you wake, the world will be waiting with all its demands and difficulties, but perhaps you will face it knowing that others have faced similar challenges before you, have endured, have prevailed or failed with dignity, have left behind stories to light the way. Thank you for walking with me through this landscape of myth and memory. Until we meet again in some other quiet corner of history, may your sleep be peaceful, your dreams be gentle, and your waking find you renewed and ready for whatever story you are writing with your own life, your own choices, your own courage in the face of an uncertain world. Good night.